The Northern War marked the culmination of a tumultuous couple of centuries in Northern Europe. This war not only changed the balance of power in the region, but on the continent as a whole. At the end of the conflict, one of Europe's newest and most militarized powers lay in ruins, and from its ashes, an empire previously on the fringe of European affairs would start its explosive rise. Welcome to our video on the Great Northern War, on how the Swedish Empire ended and the Russian Empire rose, opening the way to a new era of European history. These long videos are extremely difficult to make, and we hope you'll grace us with your likes, comments, and shares.
This conflict is absolutely packed with big names and big battles, and there's another place that goes even bigger. It's our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. You probably know it as the mobile game that plays like a console game, a world of massive raids with over 600 champions to build your team from. With so many, it can be hard to decide who to take, so here's our advice. Don't mess around. Take the guy who's dripping head to toe in gold. It's legendary tier champion Cardio. He buffs critical hits and removes debuffs on your party, making him perfect for arena battles and killing bosses. Raid's 3-year anniversary party just ended, but there are still special events with loads of champions and goodies right now. So, enter via our link in the description or QR code to get $40 of rewards right away, including 3 champions, Misericord, Tiger Soul and Romero, plus 10 Magic XP brews, 10 Force XP brews, and 10 Spirit brews. All this treasure will be waiting for you here.
The ascension of Gustavus Adolphus to the throne of Sweden in 1611 is generally regarded as the starting point of the Swedish Empire. The able young king inherited a multitude of conflicts in the region, most notably the Ingrian War against the Tsardom of Russia. The war was concluded with the Peace of Stolbovo in 1618, which stipulated that Sweden would gain Ingria and parts of Karelia, thereby denying Russia access to the Baltic Sea. Russia, which was still recovering from the time of troubles, was unable to offer any significant resistance to Swedish expansion. The war with Poland-Lithuania, which had been sporadically raging on since 1600, was concluded in 1629. Gustavus Adolphus was not able to force Sigismund III of Poland to renounce his claims on the Swedish throne, but he was able to keep most of Livonia, including the important port city of Riga, and gain valuable trade concessions. In 1618, one of the most destructive conflicts in history, the 30 Years' War, had started as well. Although the last phases of the Swedish-Polish War are considered to be a part of the 30 Years' War, the Kingdom of Sweden did not involve itself directly in the war before the King of Denmark, the former champion of Protestantism, had been defeated. Worried about Catholic domination in the empire, Gustavus Adolphus, who was a leader of a Protestant nation himself, intervened on the Protestant side. Although the Catholics were close to a complete victory, the Swedish involvement changed the tides of the war. Sweden's superior army dominated the battlefield even after the death of Gustavus, and by 1648, the war was grinding down to a stalemate. Large parts of Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire, were left decimated demographically, economically, and militarily. In contrast, the Kingdom of Sweden, by acquiring territories in Pomerania and Bremen-Verden at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, became the preeminent power in the Baltic region and one of Europe's leading states. Sweden may have been the dominant power in Northern and Eastern Europe. However, its supremacy in the Baltic was incomplete. Only several years after the Peace of Westphalia, they went to war against Poland in what became known as the Deluge. Even though the Swedes were dominating for most of the war, by the end, the coalition assembled against them proved to be too difficult to deal with, and peace was signed. The peace was a merely symbolic victory for Sweden, as the Polish monarchs finally abandoned their claim to the Swedish throne. Moreover, it also proved that the Kingdom of Sweden could not survive for too long against an organized coalition of enemies. Charles XI ascended to the throne of Sweden in 1660, and the majority of his rule was peaceful, barring the relatively short Scanian War of 1675 to 1679. During the war, Sweden managed to defeat Scania, but lost some of its lands in Germany, mostly due to the inefficiency of the army. After the war, Charles XI revitalized the economy and administration of Sweden. However, his most notable reforms were of a military nature. Those reforms aimed to make the Swedish army one of the best in Europe. Charles XI's death in 1697 left his only son, Charles XII, as the new Swedish king. As Charles XII was barely 15 at the time, Peter I of Russia and Christian V of Denmark saw this as an ideal opportunity to exploit Sweden's apparent weakness. On the 21st of April 1699, Russia and Denmark concluded a treaty of mutual assistance in future wars against Sweden. One of the secret articles of the treaty, however, stipulated that Russia would only join the war after it made peace with the Ottoman Empire. Shortly afterwards, Peter concluded a treaty with Augustus of Saxony, who was also the elected ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Augustus was a very proud and extravagant ruler, and his main goal was to return Livonia to the Commonwealth. Livonia, although a land that brought insurmountable wealth to the Swedish crown, was also a source of great concern. After Sweden had gained Livonia in 1629 through the Treaty of Altmark, it gave certain assurances to the old Livonian nobility that they would preserve the rights that they had had under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that they would not lose any of the lands that were in their possession. For the first couple of decades, the relationship between the Swedish monarchs and the Livonian nobility was amicable. Charles X, however, was not as lenient as his predecessors, and by 1655, he intended to revoke a quarter of the lands that belonged to the Livonian nobility, only with the Second Northern War preventing him from doing so. Charles XI would turn his father's plans into a reality after ascending to the throne, and by the time of his death in 1697, the Livonian nobility held only a fifth of the original number of estates. One of the nobles, Johann Reinhold Patkul, outraged by the Great Reduction, agitated the Livonian nobility to rise up against Sweden in rebellion. He was swiftly arrested and sentenced to death, and to avoid execution, Patkul fled from Sweden. Patkul later played a key role in the formation of the anti-Swedish coalition, as he was usually the diplomatic link between Peter, Augustus and Christian, and provided intelligence on the Swedish defences in the Baltic. Sensing the impending danger, Charles XII sent diplomats to Russia in the summer of 1699, with the goal of confirming a peace treaty between the two states from 1661. A skillful diplomat, Peter the Great assured the envoys of his peaceful intentions, but in reality he had already decided to go to war. Augustus II also sent a diplomatic envoy to Sweden, assuring the king of his friendly intentions and asking for Swedish mediation in a dispute between himself and Prussia. While all of these dialogues took place, the coalition continued its preparations for war. Ultimately, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp became alarmed by the Danish naval buildup and informed his ally Charles XII of what had been transpiring. Though both the Swedes and Holstein had tried to resolve the matter peacefully, the new King of Denmark, Frederick IV, refused to negotiate. The first act of war was committed by Frederick's troops in March of 1700, when the Danish army entered lands belonging to the Duke of Holstein, and shortly afterwards laid siege to Tønning. Simultaneously, on the other side of the Baltic Sea, Saxon forces under Augustus entered Livonia and captured the port of Dunemunda. Charles XII, together with his war council, seeing the Danish threat as more immediate, decided to strike at them first. Great Britain and the Netherlands were uneasy at the prospect of a destructive war in the Baltic, as they had trade interests in the region. Fearing that the conflict might destabilize their economies, The maritime powers deployed their fleets to Öresund to ensure that no lasting harm to trade and their merchants would be done. By August, a Swedish force of 16,000 had assembled in Scania. So attacking the main Danish army and lifting the siege of Tønning seemed like the most secure way to deal a decisive defeat to Frederick IV. Charles opted for the riskier option of attacking the Danish mainland itself. The Swedish fleet, with Charles himself and his troops on board, managed to outmaneuver their more formidable Danish counterpart and make contact with the British and Dutch fleet. The maritime powers were willing to assist the Swedish king, so the Danish fleet was forced to retreat to Copenhagen. Skillfully avoiding parts of the island where coastal batteries were present, Swedish troops subsequently disembarked on Zealand. The Danish mustered up around 700 men and 7 artillery pieces to attack the Swedish disembarking forces. However, they were no match for the 2,500 Swedish soldiers led by Charles himself. It was here that Charles XII saw battle for the first time and proved himself an excellent leader, being the first one to jump into the water and lead the assault. The Danish were caught completely by surprise with this move, and were starting to panic, as the Swedish army was within a stone's throw of their capital. A few days after Charles set foot on Zealand, more Swedish soldiers landed there as well, and preparations were made for the march on Copenhagen. Meanwhile, the Swedish, Dutch and British fleets blockaded and started bombarding Copenhagen from the sea. With Copenhagen surrounded on both land and sea, Frederick IV of Denmark made peace with the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, and peace with Sweden was achieved soon afterwards as well. On the 18th of August 1700, the same day that peace was made between Denmark and Sweden, Peter I of Russia declared war on Sweden and began his offensive into Ingria. The first target of Peter the Great's campaign was Narva, a crucial fort near the Baltic Sea. Peter besieged Narva with an army more than 30,000 strong, and with more than 150 cannons. Such an artillery force would have reduced Narva to rubble, were it not for the fact that the Russians suffered from a lack of ammunition due to bad roads. With trouble brewing in the west, in what would become the War of the Spanish Succession, the fleet of the maritime powers transported the Swedish army back to the mainland before setting sail westwards. As the Swedish army was fully united, Charles was able to set sail for Livonia. Though Dunamunda fell to Saxon forces quickly and with little resistance, Patkul gravely misjudged the loyalty and intentions of the Livonian nobility. He had expected the Livonian nobility to join Augustus and Riga to fall quickly too. However, Livonian support was minimal, and Saxon forces alone were not strong enough to take the city. Learning of the Danish defeat, Augustus II retreated across the Dunaj River in hope that Charles would agree to a ceasefire. Charles arrived with a part of his army in Pernau in autumn. As Augustus retreated beyond the Dunaj River for winter quarters, Charles decided to head towards Narva and the Russian army. The rest of the Swedish War Council, along with foreign emissaries, tried to persuade Charles to postpone the attack on the Russian army until after the winter had passed and the army was united. Charles, however, wished nothing other than to meet his enemy in open battle, and not even the knowledge of the size of the Russian army could dissuade him. While marching towards Narva on the 7th of November, a part of the Swedish army clashed with a Russian raiding party under the command of Boris Sheremetyev at Jõhvi. Although the Russian raiding party suffered relatively heavy casualties compared to the Swedish ones, General Sheremetyev became aware of how far the Swedish army was from Narva. On the 18th of November, Charles XII arrived with his army at the village of Lagena, about 8 kilometers away from Narva. Seeing that many of the horses were ill and that there was heavy snowfall, he knew he needed to act quickly. As soon as he was certain that Narva had not fallen and that his men were ready, Charles left Lagena. Meanwhile, the Russians, being aware that the Swedish army was on its way, began defensive preparations. Trenches were dug around the Narva River's meander, and wooden stakes were placed in the center on the Goldenhof Hill. There were 2 rows of ramparts running alongside the trench as well, and between them there were soldiers' barracks. Several artillery batteries were placed along the trenches, although they would not have any effect on the battle, as the Russian army ran out of ammunition several weeks before. Sources differ when it comes to the exact size of the Russian army, but modern estimates agree that they had between 35,000 and 40,000 men at their disposal, with the overwhelming majority being infantry. The Russian forces were stretched for over 6 kilometers on their side of the trenches. The Russian army was under the general command of Peter I and Field Marshal Fyodor Golovin. The right wing of the Russian forces were commanded by General Avtonom Golovin, the center by Ivan Trubetskoy, and the left by Adam Vierder. The Russian cavalry, placed on the far side of their left wing, near the bank of the Narva River, was commanded by Boris Sheremetyev. The Swedes had around 9,000 men, out of which 5,500 were grenadiers, 3,500 dragoon cavalry, and 37 cannons. The army was split into 2 relatively equal parts. The right wing contained 3,000 grenadiers, and was commanded by Otto Welling, a veteran of the Scanian War. It was divided into 3 columns, with the one in the center being smaller and being hollow in the middle. The left wing was divided into 2 groups, with one being commanded by Field Marshal Carl Gustav Rientsköld and the other by Magnus Steenbock. Rientsköld had around 1,500 infantry, divided into 2 columns, while Steenbock had 1,000 infantrymen under his command. The Swedish cavalry was positioned on the flanks, mostly in order to guard the infantry against Russian flanking maneuvers. Charles XII himself led the cavalry on the left flank. The Swedish artillery corps, under the command of Johan Hublad, had 16 artillery pieces placed in between the left and right wing of the army, and 21 were positioned on the left wing. Moving his army through the forest and barely passable trails, Charles reached the outskirts of Narva and positioned himself on Germansberg Hill. After performing reconnaissance of the Russian defences, at 10 AM on the 19th, Charles positioned his army in preparation for battle. He was hoping to meet Peter on the battlefield. However, the Tsar had left Narva the day before the battle, taking Fyodor Golovin with him. The command of the army was passed to Charles Eugene de Croy, a Saxon diplomatic envoy to Peter. De Croy, aware of his lack of military skill, was initially unwilling to take command of the army. However, it is said that Peter convinced him over a glass of wine. Avtonom Golovin, Vierder, and Trubetskoy were just as inexperienced as de Croy was. The most capable Russian commander at Narva was Boris Sheremetyev, although he was passed over for holding a lower rank than the others. The Russian commanders, even though fielding a superior force, were unwilling to commit to open battle, fearing that the Swedish army that they were seeing was merely the vanguard of a much greater unit. The battle commenced when Charles ordered his soldiers to fire 2 volleys at their enemies and advance towards the trenches. At 2 PM, the weather changed. A heavy snowstorm and hailstorm started, and the wind was blowing directly in the face of the Russian soldiers. Using the snowstorm as a screen, Charles ordered his men to fill up the trenches with fascines and start directly assaulting the Russian positions. In less than 15 minutes, the Swedish infantry filled up the trenches enough for their cavalry to pass. The Russian soldiers did not see the Swedes until they were right in front of them. The infantry under the command of Rientsköld quickly captured the artillery batteries in the center, while the infantry under Steenbock directly assaulted the Russian army. Due to the number of barracks and the bad positioning of the Russian ramparts, the Russian troops did not have much room to maneuver, and brutal close-quarters combat ensued, where the Swedish soldiers had the clear upper hand. Due to the relentless Swedish assault and the surprise of the attack, the majority of the Russian right flank descended into complete disarray. A large number of the soldiers fled towards the bridge to the north. Few managed to escape though, as the bridge collapsed under their weight, taking many men with it to the bottom of the river. Many of the Russian soldiers tried swimming across the ice-cold river as well, with almost all drowning in the process. The soldiers who were left in the trenches also started to flee, only to be forced back by Charles's dragoons. The only part of the Russian right which still posed some organized resistance were the elite Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky guards. They created a wagon fort on the far side of the Russian right wing, near the Narva River. Continuous assaults against the wagon fort did not yield any results, and the Swedish army suffered heavy casualties. In the meantime, the Swedish right wing saw as much success as the left. The Russian forces were quickly routed, and part of the Swedish right was able to join the left wing shortly afterwards. Sheremetyev, seeing that the cavalry would be useless in this type of close-quarters combat, fled southwards. De Croix, also aware of how dire the situation was, decided to surrender to Charles. As night began to fall, the battle became even more fierce and bloody. Charles drew up many of his footmen in between the city and the entrenchments so that he could not be surprised from any side. Wishing to cut the lines of communication between what was left of the Russian army's wings, Charles ordered Hublot to capture the artillery battery on Goldenhof Hill. By morning, General Golovin surrendered as well. His troops were allowed to keep their arms, as Charles admired the bravery of the two elite guards. General Wiede, learning of the surrender of the right wing, subsequently surrendered the left wing. After receiving the arms and standards of the left wing, Charles allowed the rest of the Russian army to leave over the bridge, which his forces had already repaired. The battle was a catastrophe for the Russians, as their casualties amounted up to 10,000 men, with De Croix and most of the other commanders ending up as prisoners. The Swedish army, on the other hand, lost less than 1,500 men. To make matters worse for the Russians, the Swedes had captured 143 cannons and 28 mortars, almost the entire amount of artillery that Peter the Great had at his disposal, as well as the entire Russian baggage train. The Battle of Narva confirmed two things to Europe: that the Swedish army was one of the best, and that the Russian army was as ineffective as it was large. Charles XII, merely 18 years of age, proved that he was a more than capable military commander who, backed by an army of as great quality as the Swedish one, could overcome the insurmountable odds that were stacked against him. With the victory at Narva, a complete Swedish victory in the war seemed like a distinct possibility. On the other hand, knowing that his army was merely beginning to reform, Peter the Great was not disheartened, and he famously remarked, "They have beaten us, they might beat us again, but in time they will teach us how to beat them." While Charles and his forces settled around Dorpat for winter quarters, news of his victory at Narva created shockwaves throughout Europe. Peter the Great, realizing that Augustus II might already be trying to enter peace negotiations with Sweden, offered the Saxon elector financial and military help in return for staying in the war. By the beginning of the campaigning season, in May, reinforcements from Sweden arrived in Revel, and they joined the main Swedish army in the middle of June. Having united his forces, Charles set off for Riga on June 17th. However, as the Russians frequently raided and harassed Swedish positions, he was forced to leave behind 6,000 men in Ingria and Estonia under the command of Schlippenbach. Although the Saxon army besieged Riga from the beginning of the war, they did not have the manpower or the equipment to take the well-fortified city. After learning of the arrival of the Swedish army in Livonia in late 1700, the Saxon troops retreated beyond the Duna River, modern Daugava, for winter quarters. During the winter season, the Saxons, under the command of Steinau, heavily fortified their side of the river in preparation for a possible Swedish crossing. The Swedish army arrived near Riga on July 14th, and Charles, being aware that making a direct crossing would be a huge risk and quite costly in manpower, opted to weaken the Saxon defense first. several hundred of his horsemen, as well as part of Riga's garrison, were ordered to head upriver towards Cockenhusen, a seemingly ideal place for a crossing. As a result, Steinau was forced to stretch his forces thin to cover both the possible crossing points at Cockenhusen and the one near Riga. On the evening of the 18th, Swedish forces embarked on transport ships at Fassenholm and began their crossing. Meanwhile, engineers were ordered to create a makeshift floating bridge across the river as well. The crossing Swedish army, led by Charles himself, consisted of around 7,000 grenadiers and only 100 cavalry, while their Saxon counterpart had a 20,000-strong army on their side. As soon as the transport boats reached the middle of the river, the Saxon artillery started firing at them. However, the artillery barrage would be ineffective. At the same time, the Swedish artillery, placed both on their side of the river and on two riverboats, began shelling the Saxon redoubts. Awaiting the Swedish assault, a Saxon army under the command of Steinau drew up in two lines between the two redoubts. The army that Steinau managed to gather in such a short period of time consisted only of about 3,500 men, and it was made up mostly of infantry and a small amount of cavalry on the flanks. Charles, seeing that such a force was descending upon his men, drew up around 3,000 grenadiers and prepared for the Saxon assault. The Saxons attacked the Swedish army furiously. However, their assault was halted, and they were forced to retreat after the Swedish army fired several volleys. This allowed for more Swedish troops to disembark and join the main body of the army, while at the same time, more of Steinau's men joined the fight as well. Undaunted by their initial failure, the entirety of the Saxon infantry drew up in a line and charged, meeting the same fate once again. On their third try, the Saxon cavalry tried to attack Charles's right flank. However, a part of the Swedish cavalry that just disembarked managed to push it back. This pattern of Saxon assaults and retreats dragged on until 7 AM on the next day, when the Swedish army captured the first redoubt. Steinau deemed it impossible to defend such a position and subsequently ordered a retreat. The majority of the Saxon army retreated unscathed to the forts of Dunemunda and Kobrin, as bad weather prevented the Swedish engineers from finishing the bridge in time so that their cavalry could assault the Saxon army. Still, the Saxons lost more than 2,000 in this action, while Charles's casualties were around 500. In the following days, Kobrin and Dunemunda fell to the Swedish army, with Cockenhusen and the rest of Livonia and Kurland falling into their hands in the next few weeks. A small Russian army under Repnin that was sent by Peter to support the Saxons retreated to the east without participating in the battle. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been neutral up until that point, with the majority of their magnates opposing the war with Sweden and using the liberum veto to avoid it. Charles himself was in a position of power at that moment and could have signed a peace treaty with Augustus. Aware of the elector's deceitful nature, the young Swedish king knew that there would be no peace with Poland for as long as Augustus remained king. Therefore, dethroning him seemed like the only option to secure Livonia and advance to Russia unhindered. It is also speculated that Charles had taken a personal disliking towards Augustus, as the two of them had quite opposite personalities. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was far from what it once was. The cracks on the internal political machine of the state were evident. Many of the magnates did not support their elected king, and some were even openly against him. In the beginning of autumn in 1701, as soon as Charles started advancing into Kurland, he was met by several minor Lithuanian nobles, asking him to avoid taking control of their lands in exchange for their logistical support. Lithuania was, at the time, divided between two powerful noble families, the Oginsky and the Sapieha. Augustus himself was at odds with the Sapieha family, and allowed the Oginski to raid their lands with impunity. The two counts of Sapieha, seeing an opportunity to protect their lands and expand their influence, met with Charles as well, offering their support in exchange for protection against Oginski and the dethroning of Augustus. Although minor Swedish expeditions took place in Lithuania in the last few months of 1701, with Kaunas and Vilnius falling by January, no significant result was achieved, as Oginski refused to give open battle and was still harassing the Swedish forces. By February of 1702, Charles returned to Kurland and started making preparations for his advance on Warsaw. Seeing the gravity of the situation, Augustus called for a diet in the capital, asking the Polish nobility for support. The diet did not resolve any crucial issues, with many magnates using that chance to voice their dissatisfaction with Augustus. Nevertheless, the nobility agreed to send 5 of their members to Charles to try and negotiate a peace once again, this time with the Dutch Republic's mediation. The 5 diplomats, some nobles and some members of the Catholic Church, met with Charles on several occasions. The divisions in the ranks of the Commonwealth were seen here as well. At first, the diplomats tried to convince Charles to agree to their peace terms. However, after several days, they started bickering among themselves, much to the Swedish king's annoyance. Incensed by their disrespect, Charles halted all further negotiations and moved for Warsaw, determined to take it. Having learned of the Swedish king's inflexibility, Augustus decided to leave Warsaw for the old capital of Krakow. With Warsaw falling to the Swedes by late spring, Augustus attempted a last-ditch effort to secure peace and sent the Archbishop of Gniezno, Cardinal Radziejowski. Unknown to Augustus, the cardinal had already exchanged several letters with Charles, assuring him of his friendly intentions. Whether the cardinal intended to betray Augustus at that point still remains unclear. Furthermore, after spending some time with Charles, the cardinal advised him against dethroning the king, as the Polish people would not only change their attitude towards the Swedes, but also that they would never view the new king as legitimate. As Augustus still was not decisively defeated, Charles did not give too much thought to the cardinal's advice, but focused on the war instead. It was the middle of June when Charles began his march towards Krakow. He reached the town of Kielce, where he learned that Augustus linked up with the Polish army under Lubomirski at Sandomierz. After an unsuccessful Saxon ambush on a Swedish scouting unit, the Swedes learned of Augustus's position at Klisov. On the morning of the 17th of July, Charles departed from Kielce at the head of his army, reaching the village of Opietza, which was 4 kilometers away from Klisov, on the evening of the same day. Even though the Swedish army was smaller and lacked cavalry, Charles wanted to attack. Ultimately, he heeded the advice of his generals and waited for one more day for his cavalry to arrive. As the Swedish cavalry arrived on the 18th, so did rumors about a Saxon attack, which was supposed to take place on the morning of the 19th. However, the Saxon army had not turned up by 9 AM, so Charles drew up his army and began marching towards their positions at Klisov. He had roughly 12,000 men at his disposal, with about 8,000 grenadiers and 4,000 cavalry, as well as 4 artillery pieces. The army was drawn up in 2 lines. The cavalry was placed on the wings and the infantry in the center. The right wing was commanded by Charles XII himself, the center by von Lewin, and the left wing by Duke Frederick IV of Holstein-Gottorp. The majority of the Swedish army advanced through the forest towards Klisov, with only the left wing taking the more open route. Just as the Swedish left arrived on the plains outside Klisov, they were noticed by a Saxon cavalry regiment that was led by Augustus. As the Saxon elector was confident that only a small unit was advancing towards his positions, he lowered his guard and did not take the threat seriously. Charles, seeing the element of surprise as critical, ordered his cavalry to lower their standards and the infantry to lower their pikes, just as they passed onto the plains outside Klisov. Augustus fell for that trap as well, and perceived the Swedish army as only a reconnaissance unit. The Saxon army consisted of 16,000 men, 9,000 of whom were infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Augustus also had an 8,000 strong Polish cavalry unit, consisting of 1,000 elite winged hussars, 3,000 panzerni, 500 dragoons, and 3,500 Cossacks and Wallachian light horse. The army of Augustus also had the majority of its infantry in the center and the cavalry on the flanks. The left wing was led by von Tremper, the center by Schulenberg, and the right by von Flemming, while the Polish units on the far right were led by Lubomirski. Augustus's forces occupied the higher ground, where they placed their 46 artillery pieces, and their position was also additionally protected by a chevaux de frise. At noon, Charles ordered his right wing to pass around the woodlot in front of it from the left side, also the center and left wing to advance directly towards the Saxon positions. Now aware that this was not just a reconnaissance unit, but the main Swedish army, Augustus ordered his artillery to fire on the Swedish forces. Right before the Saxon camp, there was a dense marsh from the village of Kokot to the village of Vyszbica, which hindered the Swedish advance. The Saxons were in a very advantageous position at that point, their artillery wreaking havoc upon the Swedish army. Charles XII, seeing the absolute impossibility of attacking the enemy directly, ordered his army to wheel to the left, thereby taking higher ground and disengaging from the marshes. The Saxon army, now being forced to draw towards the right, left its advantageous positions on the high ground, and a part of it ended up in the marshes instead. At 2 p.m, the Swedish left wing began its attack. Just as Frederick IV was marching towards the Polish cavalry, he was struck by a cannonball and was taken to his tent, where he would die a few hours later. Now commanded by Welling, the Swedish left still charged the Polish cavalry thrice, completely crushing even the winged hussars and forcing the entire wing to rout. Afterwards, Charles took control of the left and began advancing towards the Saxon center. To avoid being outflanked, the Saxon center began a retreat. However, they exposed themselves to the elite Swedish infantry in the center, which began firing destructive volleys at them, dealing massive casualties. The Saxon retreat was made even more difficult by the marshland which was behind their initial position, and the Swedish soldiers used that opportunity to shoot as many of them down as possible. On the other side of the battlefield, the Saxon cavalry attacked the Swedish right wing. Though the Saxons initially had the upper hand there, they were repulsed by the Swedish right and were forced to retreat. As the main Saxon army had already routed, their left ran into the rest of the Swedish army on their retreat. The Saxon left bravely fought to escape from their encirclement. However, they lost many men to the fire from the Swedish infantry in the process. In the end, the winning Swedish army lost less than 1,000 men, while the Saxons lost 3,700, 1,700 of whom were captured. The exact number of Polish casualties is unknown, however they are noted to have been great. The Swedish army also ended up in possession of the 46 Saxon artillery pieces and their war chest. Augustus's downplaying of the danger which the Swedish army posed to his own cost him the advantageous initial position. That, combined with the superiority of the Swedish soldiers and Charles's tactical acumen, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle for the Saxon-Polish army. Augustus retreated with what was left of his army to Sandomierz, hoping to get more support from the Diet there, while on the 31st of July, Charles entered Krakow. The Battle of Klisov marked the last time that the famed winged hussars were used in battle. Symbolically, it would also mark the beginning of the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This decisive victory brought Charles one step closer to a complete victory, which seemed impossible less than 2 years ago. A couple of weeks later, a 12,000-strong Swedish army from Pomerania arrived in Krakow as well. Augustus, seeing the gravity of the situation, left Sandomierz with 4,000 cavalry and advanced towards Warsaw to retake it. He had hoped to call for another diet and gather military and financial support from the nobility. The diet did not go according to his plans though, as an increasing number of noblemen voiced their dissatisfaction with the fact that Augustus involved the Commonwealth in the war. Several noblemen even threatened to openly back Charles in the conflict. Growing more desperate, Augustus sent countless envoys to the Swedish king in the autumn of 1702. However, Charles would not accept any of the terms that were offered. Fearing that all of his offers to Charles would go unanswered, Augustus begged for the aid of his liege via the Electorate of Saxony, the Holy Roman Emperor. Leopold I acquiesced, though his motives were not as selfless as they seemed, as the treaty he offered Charles stipulated that Sweden and Poland would end all hostilities, and that all Saxon troops would leave to join the Imperial army in the War of the Spanish Succession. The young king dismissed even this offer, as he was determined to defeat Augustus completely. By 1703, Augustus was forced to flee Warsaw again, while Charles continued consolidating his position in Poland. Although we have neglected this theatre of war for some time, it is time to return to Ingria and Estonia. As Charles turned southwards after the Battle of Narva, Tsar Peter was given some much-needed time to reinforce and improve the Russian army. Boris Sheremetev, the only Russian commander to have escaped after the Battle of Narva, was given command over the Russian forces in the north. Small raids into Estonia and Ingria were conducted regularly during 1701, but they were not decisive by any means. The first serious attempt to probe the Swedish defences in the area was made in September, when Sheremetev led a 7,000-strong army into Estonia. However, von Schlippenbach intercepted the Russian advance with a 3 times smaller army and defeated Sheremetev at Reuj. On the 7th of January 1702, Schlippenbach, who was posted between Arasfer and Aya, received word from one of his commanders that Sheremetev was advancing with a large force towards his position. Although Schlippenbach received another piece of information that the Russian force was merely a raiding party, he immediately departed towards the village of Aya. The next day at 4 p.m, the alarm sounded that the Russian forces were approaching Varban. Swedish reconnaissance learned that the Russians were carrying 2,000 wooden stakes and 30 cannons, which meant that the force was not a raiding party but an actual army. Still unaware of the true size of the Russian army, Schlippenbach ordered Baron Lewin to harass them with his cavalry, while he gathered as many men as he could. The Swedes were accustomed to fighting while outnumbered, however this time they faced a massive 6-to-1 disadvantage. Facing the 12,000 to 13,000 strong Russian vanguard, Lewin's forces were easily massacred. The Russian army advanced quickly afterwards, which ensured that Schlippenbach could not muster all of his men. Finally, the two main forces faced each other near the village of Kamar. Schlippenbach had around 3,000 men under his command, as well as 6 artillery pieces. Meanwhile, Sheremetev had 18,000 men and 30 cannons. Schlippenbach, now heading the cavalry, decided to attack a part of the Russian vanguard to give time to his infantry and artillery to form up and prepare. While the Swedish cavalry was fighting against the sea of Russian soldiers, several Russian regiments cut them off from the rest of their army. This forced Schlippenbach to retreat, suffering minor losses in the process. Although Tsar Peter was doing his best to reform the army, it was only a year after the Battle of Narva, and the Russian soldiers were still inexperienced and poorly trained. Schlippenbach saw the immobile mass of Russian soldiery as the perfect target for his own artillery corps. In a letter to Charles XII, he remarked, "The enemy, having presently followed us, were so well greeted on their arrival by the cannon and foot that they broke and retreated." Finally, the entire Russian army drew up for battle. Judging the situation too unfavorable, Schlippenbach decided to retreat to Arastver, where several hundred Swedish soldiers arrived during the beginning of the battle. The Russian forces were constantly harassing the Swedish army, barely giving them a chance to form up. Finally, at Arastver, Schlippenbach managed to properly deploy his army, with the infantry in the center and the cavalry on the flanks. The battle started with an exchange of volleys. Although the Russian forces vastly outnumbered their Swedish counterparts, the fighting was a stalemate due to the Swedish army's superior training. The tide of battle turned when the 30 Russian cannons started firing. Not only did the Swedes suffer major losses due to this, but some of their artillery was disabled as well. Schlippenbach, seeing no other choice, opted for a risky tactic. He ordered his cavalry to alternately cover the infantry and artillery while they were under fire. This move backfired, as the cavalry started fleeing because of the massive incoming fire, and they ran into their own men. Disorder broke within the Swedish ranks, and all the while the Russian army started advancing towards them. Schlippenbach and his officers tried to rally the troops, however it was too late. Some of the cavalry managed to cover the retreat to Dorpat, while much of the infantry was killed or captured. Peter was so elated at the news of his army's victory that he promoted Sheremetev to field marshal and sounded the bells in Moscow for the people to hear. After Arastver, the Russians faced almost no significant opposition in the area and were able to advance deep into Ingria. In the summer of 1702, the main Russian army, under the command of Peter himself, made preparations at the settlement of Ladoga to assault the Swedish fort of Notbori. Before he would begin the siege, the Tsar wanted to ensure that his army would not be vulnerable to a Swedish surprise attack. With Schlippenbach's army no longer a factor, the only two remaining threats in the area were a 5,000-strong army at Nienschatz, led by Kroniot, and the Swedish Ladoga flotilla. With Kroniot unwilling to leave the safety of his fort, and with the destruction of the Ladoga flotilla in late August, Peter was now free to advance on Notbori. The Russian army arrived near Notbori on the 27th or 28th of September 1702. Although the fort of Notbori was in essence a medieval fort, with high walls and towers, it had an excellent defensive position. It was placed on the mouth of the Neva River into Lake Ladoga. In addition, the fort also encompassed almost the entirety of the island, rendering any amphibious assault nearly impossible. Although sources offer diverging details, the size of the Russian army was estimated to have been between 20,000 and 30,000 men, together with 50 artillery pieces. The Swedish garrison was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Gustav Wilhelm von Schlippenbach, uncle of the aforementioned General Schlippenbach. It numbered around 225 men, with 124 guns, most of which were small. On the first days of the siege, Swedish boats freely sailed up the Neva and brought reinforcements and provisions to the garrison. The Swedish defenders now numbered around 250. Peter considered the constant reinforcements a threat to his Ingrian campaign, so he sent 50 gunboats to the Neva River to put a stop to Swedish river operations. The defenders fired their artillery at the boats, however it was ineffective and the Russians suffered no losses. At the beginning of October, Kroniot sent 500 of his own men to Notboyi. In the end, only 50 managed to reach the fort due to Russian attacks. As the Russians had lost all of their artillery at the Battle of Narva 2 years prior, they made an extraordinary effort to replace their lost and outdated artillery pieces, even going as far as to melt down church bells for the material. The new Russian artillery corps was quite effective. The artillery barrages were strong, with the fort's walls and towers beginning to crumble after several days of intense fire. With only a few of the Swedish cannons actually able to reach the Russian army, Russian losses were low. By the 7th of October, the Russian army started preparing for an assault, and on the 9th, ladders were given to the volunteers. The first few minor assaults were easily repulsed by the Swedes. though their aim was most likely to just test the Swedish defences. On the 11th, a large firebomb was shot into the fort, and the mass assault began. With the walls breached in 3 places, the garrison was stretched thin. The first storming was attempted at 4 AM. However, by 6 o'clock it was stopped due to mounting losses and a stubborn Swedish defence. The second assault also failed, while the third one technically succeeded, as the Swedes were left with only a handful of men. That evening, the Swedish commander surrendered the fort and gave Peter the key to the city, which symbolized that Notboji was the key to the Neva River. Peter, recognizing that as well, renamed the city to Schlüsselburg and placed it under the command of his most trusted general, Menshikov. The siege, though relatively short, left the Russian army exhausted, and the Tsar's desire to repair and improve the fort gave them some time to recover. Charles was aware of the situation in the north, however he did not see the Russian advances as a significant threat, and continued pursuing his goals in Poland. As the campaigning season of 1703 began, the Russian army left Schlüsselburg and advanced towards the mouth of the river Neva. The mouth of the river was guarded by a fort called Nienkens. Hearing that the Russian army was approaching, the Swedish garrison burned the fort to the ground. Peter the Great captured what was left of Nienkens on the 1st of May, and on the 27th decided to found a new city there, Russia's future capital, St. Petersburg. In order to build the superior city and the fortresses around it, tens of thousands of serfs were forcefully brought to St. Petersburg. Along with them, Peter also invited many architects, engineers and shipwrights from Western Europe to help him build the city of his dreams. These extraordinary efforts seem to have paid off, as by 1704 St. Petersburg began sprawling outwards from the main fortress, and 2 new fortresses were built alongside it. There were several Swedish attempts at reconquering the city in the next few years, however all of them were unsuccessful. Back in Poland, Charles managed to obtain the support of enough of the Polish nobility to have Stanisław Leszczyński crowned as the new king. On the other hand, Augustus still mounted a significant resistance, as he controlled the majority of the Polish army. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth subsequently descended into chaos, as the Sandomierz Confederation, led by Augustus, and the Warsaw Confederation, led by Stanisław, began fighting a brutal civil war. Due to the chaotic nature of the conflict, forts and cities continuously changed hands between the 2 confederations and Sweden, and it's difficult to discern who controlled several parts of the Commonwealth at different points in time. With most of Ingria secure, and any larger Swedish armies in the Baltic neutralized, in the spring of 1704, Tsar Peter turned towards the last 2 Swedish strongholds in the area, Narva and Dorpat. In April, the commander at Narva, Henning Rudolf Horn, asked the Swedish government for more men and supplies, as Russian soldiers were gathering on the other side of the river. He had also asked the navy to attack Nienschatz to relieve some of the pressure on Narva. It is unlikely that he received any significant aid, and by late April, the few Swedish ships that were present at the mouth of the Narva River were dislodged by Russian artillery. In early May, Russian troops started crossing the river and raiding the countryside outside Narva and Ivangorod. Narva was already suffering from supply shortages due to the large garrison and refugees, and these raids only worsened the situation. With all those people living in unsanitary conditions, disease soon broke out too. At Nienschatz, Peter prepared 2 armies, one for Ingria and another for Karelia. After receiving a letter from General Apraxin that Schlippenbach was planning to take his entire army to Narva, Peter decided to send the entire force there. By late May, the Russians had complete control of the river and the surrounding areas, in effect meaning that Narva was cut off from the rest of Sweden. Schlippenbach's army was too weak to be of any use there, and the other stronghold of Dorpat was under siege too. Narva had been left to its fate. Horn had about 5,000 men under his command, with over 400 artillery pieces. The Russian army consisted of 20,000 men and 99 guns. Horn ordered several sallies in the beginning of June, which were very successful. In one of those sallies, a Russian camp near Ivangorod was looted, and much-needed supplies were brought back to the city. Peter was aware that the garrison was expecting some reinforcements from Revel, so he staged a surprise attack on the 8th of June. The Tsar had some of his men don blue uniforms and hold Swedish banners. Then they staged a mock battle with some Russian troops on the road from Revel. Horn sent a detachment to their aid, falling right into the trap. Those troops were immediately ambushed, and they lost over 50 men, including a senior officer. On the 18th, the Russians started to dig in, and by the 25th, the entire army was present for the siege. The Russian troops regularly threw hand grenades over the city walls, and they also frequently unleashed musket volleys at the defenders. The defenders were further demoralized when they learned that Boris Sheremetev had taken Dorpat on the 24th of June. By the beginning of July, the supply situation in Narva had become critical. Horn confiscated food from the burghers and the nobles for the army. This meant that the poor in the city were starving, while the rich suffered from food shortages. Over the course of the month, Russian trenches became increasingly close to the walls of Narva, and their hand grenades and musket volleys started actually claiming victims. The defenders regularly fired at the Russian army and even carried out a few sallies, however none of these were effective. In an effort to relieve Narva, a small Swedish army attacked Nienschatz. Unfortunately for the Swedes, they were easily repelled. The Russians had built several bridges over the river in the last month, ensuring that reinforcements and supplies would regularly arrive to their own troops. With the reinforcements, Peter now had over 40,000 men besieging the city. On the 30th or 31st, after Sunday service, the Russian artillery corps started heavily bombarding Narva. One of the shots hit the gunpowder and chemical warehouse, leading to a massive explosion and fire in the city. With morale being at an abysmal level, soldiers and civilians alike started surrendering and defecting to the Russian side at the beginning of August. The Russian siege leader, Ogilvy, offered lenient terms in return for surrender. Horn, however, asked for a ceasefire instead, and the Russian War Council subsequently decided to storm the city. On the 10th, the signal was given for the assault to start. Regular Russian soldiers started concentrating on the breaches in the walls, while the elite Preobrazhensky regiment climbed the walls of the bastions. Due to precise artillery fire, the Swedish artillery was rendered useless during the assault. The Swedish soldiers defended the breaches bravely, though they were forced to retreat due to concentrated musket fire. As the Russians started streaming through the breaches, Horn had a mine detonated there. This did not stop the attackers for long, as they soon started entering the city en masse. Horn retreated with a handful of men to the walls of the old city, where he was surprised to see that the only soldiers approaching were Russian ones. Left without a choice, Horn surrendered in exchange for mercy towards the city's inhabitants. In spite of the promise given to Horn, brutal looting, rape and pillaging ensued. 1,800 members of the garrison were imprisoned, while the rest were killed during the battle. On the other hand, the number of civilian casualties are thought to be huge, though the exact number is unknown. The Russians lost around 3,000 men. It was at Narva that Peter signed a treaty with Augustus, granting the Saxon monarch significant subsidies, 12,000 Russian soldiers, and lands in Ruthenia in exchange for staying in the war. Over the next year, the Russians and Saxons had devised a strategy to defeat the Swedish army and expel Charles from Poland. The Grodno campaign, as it later became known, aimed to capture the Swedish forces in a pincer movement, with a three-sided offensive from Lithuania, Ruthenia and Saxony. Charles was not sitting idly either, and by the summer of 1705, he had convinced the Diet in Warsaw to start working on a peace treaty and to crown Stanisław as king. As what was going on in Warsaw was seen as a possible catastrophe for Augustus's war effort, not to mention the fact that it represented a significant hit to his pride, He knew that he had to act quickly. A large Saxon cavalry force was sent to assault Warsaw and to stop the coronation of Stanisław. Augustus's reckless endeavour ended in a complete disaster, as the force was defeated by a much smaller Swedish army and its commander was captured. Furthermore, the Saxon commander also divulged the strategic intentions of Augustus and his allies, allowing the Swedes to thoroughly prepare for the upcoming Grodno campaign. As the majority of Livonia and Estonia were under Russian control by the beginning of the campaign, the main Russian army, along with large Saxon and Polish-Lithuanian contingents, set up for winter quarters at the fort of Grodno in Ruthenia. They expected a quick victory over the Swedish army after the campaigning season of 1706 began. However, they did not even get the chance to try. Much like his predecessor, Gustavus Adolphus, Charles force-marched his army in the dead of winter and arrived at Grodno on the 24th of January. Lacking the artillery to assault the fort, Charles opted to cross the frozen Neman River and blockade the city. Seeing that the young king was preparing to encircle them, Augustus immediately left with 5,000 men, hoping to reinforce his army in Saxony. Peter, unwilling to bring the rest of his army to relieve the siege, ordered Menshikov to leave the fort with the cavalry as soon as possible. Grodno fell in April, and the Russians lost more than a third of their initial force. They would have lost even more had Charles not misjudged the direction of Menshikov's retreat. Unable to pursue the Russian army through the thick marshlands of Polessia, Charles went westwards to seek a battle with the Saxons. As Charles was busy with the siege, Augustus had prepared to advance towards Warsaw. He led a 7,000-strong cavalry force, while the main body of the Saxon-Polish army was commanded by Schulenburg. A third Saxon army under Brauser was also advancing from Krakow. Schulenburg crossed the Oder on the 8th of February and advanced towards the town of Sława in Silesia. While this was taking place, Reinschild was resting in his winter quarters, which extended from Kostin to the border with Brandenburg. No sooner had he learned of the Saxon advance, he assembled his army and began marching towards the Oder. After discovering the movements of both Schulenburg and Brauser, Reinschild deduced that the two of them planned to avoid open battle with him and join forces at Poznan. To avoid any surprises, the Swedish commander retreated the same way from which he came, and made sure to spread the word at every town and village that he was retreating, and hoping to avoid open battle. Reinschild's information warfare proved successful, as Schulenburg gave credit to the rumors of a Swedish retreat, and decided to pursue the Swedish army instead of advancing towards Poznan. The Saxon general believed that the mere presence of his superior army would be enough to rout the Swedish force. With this strategy, Reinschild achieved two things. He drew Schulenburg's army away from any allied forces, and was able to choose a site of battle that was optimal for the Swedish army's size and composition. Upon both armies reaching the Fraustadt on the 13th of February, Reinschild started arraying his army in battle formation. It was at this point that Schulenburg realized that he had been deceived. However, he had to give battle, as it would have been scandalous for him to retreat with such a superior force. The Saxon force was around 20,000 strong, with around 10,000 Saxon and 6,000 Russian infantry, and 4,000 Saxon cavalrymen. Schulenburg assembled his infantry into two columns, between the villages of Jägersdorf and Roosdorf, and in front of it he placed 31 cannons, 44 mortars, and a chevaux de frise. 2,000 Saxon horsemen were placed on either wing. Reinschild had only 9,400 men at his disposal, with 3,700 infantry and 5,700 cavalry. He placed his cavalry on the flanks, and the majority of his infantry in a single line in the centre, while some Caroleans were also mixed in among the cavalry. Axel Sparre commanded the infantry in the centre, while Humahjelm led the left, and Reinschild himself was in charge of the right. As the Swedish army advanced, the Saxons waited until their enemies were at about 100 paces distance, then they fired all of their cannons and mortars. Although the Swedish army suffered some casualties during this barrage, they did not give the Saxons enough time for another one, as the centre and left started their charge. The Swedish centre's advance was at first checked by the chevaux de frise. However, after less than 15 minutes, the Swedish forces broke through. The Swedes, who were expertly trained at hand-to-hand combat, charged their Saxon counterparts with swords and did not fire a single shot. In spite of being under constant fire, the ferocious Carolean onslaught forced the Saxons to retreat towards the village of Bezen. The Swedish wings had even more success, as the numerically inferior Saxon cavalry began fleeing after just several minutes of fighting. Only a handful of cavalry on the Saxon right, led by Colonel Kospot, mounted a desperate defence. However, they were surrounded and broken after the rest of their wing fell. The Swedish right afterwards came upon the 6,000 Russian soldiers. The Russians had their uniforms turned inside out, as Schulenburg knew that they were inexperienced and Reinschild would target them. Their weakness was revealed though. The Russians fired only one volley at the Swedes before throwing down their arms and retreating behind the wall of spikes. After removing the chevaux de frise there, Reinschild chased down the entire Russian force and massacred them all. As all of the Saxon cavalry had fled, their Swedish counterparts were now free to surround the remainder of the army on all sides. Much like Hannibal almost 2 millennia before him, Reinschild executed a double envelopment perfectly, forcing the remainder of the Saxon army to surrender. And with that, the entire Saxon army, raised with so much toil, care and expense, and which was twice the size of the Swedish army, had been defeated in less than an hour's time. The Saxons lost more than 7,000 men during the battle itself, and had almost all of the rest imprisoned, with the total losses amounting to about 15,000 to 16,000. The Swedes lost around 400 men and also had around 1,000 men injured. Augustus's biggest problem, however, was that the road to Saxony now lay wide open and undefended. Augustus, who linked up with Brausa and had 12,000 men at his disposal, was only 80 kilometers away from Fraustadt when the battle took place. Shocked at the news of his Grand Army's complete defeat at the hands of an inferior Swedish force, Augustus hastily retreated to Krakow. Since Peter the Great was unwilling to send his army to even relieve the siege of Grodno, there wasn't any hope of Russian aid for them either. After his victory at Grodno, Charles XII turned west to prepare for the upcoming invasion of Saxony. In the next few months, Augustus desperately tried to negotiate a peace with Charles, even offering to split up the Commonwealth between himself and Stanisław. As autumn began, the Swedish armies marched into Saxony and quickly occupied Leipzig. Without any other options, Augustus agreed to all Swedish demands and signed the Treaty of Elternstadt. According to the treaty, he would renounce all of his claims to the Polish and Lithuanian crowns, annul treaties with Russia, and extradite the Swedish traitor Johann Patkul. In order to humiliate his personal enemy, Charles also forced Augustus to congratulate Stanisław on his victory and coronation. In the aftermath of defeating Polish-Saxon forces and signing the Treaty of Elternstadt in October, Charles did not leave Saxony immediately, instead choosing to settle down for winter. This was primarily done so the Swedish army could rest following 6 years of nearly constant campaigning. It also served the purpose of pressuring the Saxons into gathering the war indemnities as quickly as possible. The treaty itself was not immediately signed by Augustus, as he was still in Poland with Peter. The Tsar terrified Augustus, so much so that the Elector of Saxony did not dare tell him of his unconditional surrender. Augustus was indeed stuck between a rock and a hard place. He was forced to accompany Menshikov and the new Russian army, which Peter had sent to Poland. At the same time, He knew that facing a Swedish army in battle after surrendering would not be taken lightly by Charles. In fact, during the very signing of the treaty, Augustus was on the march from Lithuania to Lublin because Menshikov intended to fight a Swedish army in western Poland. That Swedish army, led by Mardefelt, received a letter of warning from Augustus about his situation and what Menshikov's goals were. Mardefelt, still uninformed about the signing of the Treaty of Altenstadt, thought that it was another ruse by Augustus and did the contrary of what the Elector had asked him to do. Mardefelt was initially hesitant to face Menshikov in battle due to the allied army's size. Alas, he was encouraged by the voivode of Kiev, Józef Potocki, who said that the Polish soldiers would fight to the last drop of blood, and decided to march towards the Allies' position at Kalisz. The Swedish-Polish army found an advantageous position between the villages of Dobrzec and Kozelnawicz and arrayed in battle formation. Menshikov's army formed up across from them. Mardefelt had around 4,000 men under his command, with another 9,000 to 10,000 Polish allies under Potocki. On the other hand, Menshikov had over twice as many men: 5,000 Saxons, 9,000 Russians, 4,000 to 8,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks, and another 7,000 troops belonging to the Sandomierz Confederation. The Swedish soldiers were placed in the center, while the Polish cavalry was on the flanks. Meanwhile, Menshikov placed his own Polish troops in the center and the Russian and Saxon forces on the flanks. However, he also left a cavalry contingent on the far left side for flanking purposes. Both sides had between 10 and 15 guns, although it is unknown whether they were of any significance to the battle. The battle commenced on the 29th of October between 3 and 4 p.m. Wanting to prove Mardefelt wrong for implying that the Polish were cowards who avoided battle, Potocki led his cavalry on a massive charge towards Menshikov's line. At the first charge, after only several minutes of fighting, Potocki's troops started fleeing, with some of them even retreating behind a wagon fort. The Swedish troops, now left alone against a massive army, prepared for the inevitable. Menshikov's entire army fell upon the 4,000 Swedes. Nevertheless, neither Mardefelt nor his troops would break as easily as their Polish allies did. During the fighting, both sides lost a lot of their cavalry units. The Swedish forces were slowly defeated, and in a last-ditch effort, Mardefelt formed a hollow square with whatever troops he could rally and held on until late into the night. Those troops stopped fighting and surrendered only after their enemies stopped attacking first. In fact, some sources claim that Mardefelt's men held out longer than the Polish forces behind the wagon fort. In the end, the Swedish-Polish army lost almost 5,000 men, over 2,000 of which were imprisoned, while the Allied army suffered around 3,000 casualties. As a result of this battle, Greater Poland, the only part of the Commonwealth left under Charles and his allies' control, was left undefended. Menshikov was unable to capitalize on this, however, as Augustus retreated to Warsaw and left his troops in Krakow. To smooth things over with Charles, Augustus took as many Swedish prisoners as he could and released them when he was able to do so. Still petrified at the thought of Peter's reaction to his unconditional surrender, Augustus waited until the dead of winter to leave for Saxony. Peter was enraged after learning of the Saxon capitulation because he knew that his position in Poland was hanging by a thread. The Russian army retreated across the Vistula and destroyed all of the bridges on the river, hoping to slow down the inevitable Swedish advance. Left without any proper allies, Peter tried to keep the Polish resistance against the Swedes alive by all means. At first, he tried to bribe and threaten the Polish nobility into not acknowledging Stanisław as king. With Poland devastated by the civil war, the vast majority of the magnates refused to fight the Swedes even if they did not support Stanisław. Having failed to rally the magnates to his side diplomatically, the Russians started brutally raiding the Polish and Lithuanian countryside, and they also besieged the important port of Gdansk. The siege was easily repelled, and military pressure proved to be impractical, as now Peter was just making more enemies. As a final desperate measure to keep the war in the Commonwealth alive, the Tsar sent an envoy to Pope Clement XI. He promised to work on reuniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches if the Holy See denounced Stanislav as king. Whether his intentions were sincere or not is unknown, though the talks broke down quickly regardless. Without allies, and with the Russian army exhausted by war, Peter went to great lengths to make peace with Charles. He even offered to return all of the conquered lands except for St. Petersburg and the forts along the Neva. The ambitious Charles XII was confident in victory, however, and said to his commanders, "Gentlemen, I have resolved never to make an unjust war, but to end a just one only with the utter ruin of my enemies. I will attack the first to take the field, conquer him, and then deal with the others." Hampered by the constant arrival of foreign diplomats, the slow arrival of reinforcements, and by Augustus himself, the Swedish forces only left Saxony in the autumn of 1707. At the end of the year, Charles crossed the Vistula with his army. Peter, who was celebrating Christmas in Moscow, left for Grodno immediately after hearing of the Swedish advance. He did not stay there for long, as the city was an easy target for the unified Swedish army. Incidentally, Charles entered the city 3 days after Peter left it. During his retreat to Vilnius, Peter ordered his Cossacks and Kalmyks to ravage the countryside and burn everything that the Swedish army could use. This strategy left the Swedish army with a chronic lack of supplies. Facing starvation, they took the last supplies that the peasants had, even further devastating the area. Meanwhile, Peter grew ill in early 1708, leaving all military affairs to his generals. Ill health struck him when he was facing the worst internal disorder of his reign, the Don Cossack revolt led by Bulavin. News of Peter's failing health, as well as the revolt, made the Russian army fall into disorder. Men were deserting at an alarming rate, and morale was low. The generals were also bogged down in Mahilov, as they could not agree on whether the war should be continued with Sweden. Furthermore, 32,000 men also had to be detached from the main army in order to quell Bulavin's revolt. It was anyone's guess which way Charles would go from Grodno, into Livonia or towards St. Petersburg, towards Moscow or into Ukraine. At first, he left Grodno in a northeasterly direction. Petrified at the thought of losing his new capital, Peter ordered St. Petersburg to be additionally fortified. After forcing the city of Vilnius to resupply the army, Charles turned towards the southeast and encamped at Minsk. While there, General Leeuwenhaupt informed Charles that his army in Livonia was ready to march south and support the main army. In the following weeks, some Swedish and Russian forces exchanged fire on the outskirts of the city. This incident made Charles aware of the poor state of the Russian army. Seeing this as a perfect opportunity, Charles decided to attack the Russians at Mahilov and then directly advance towards Moscow. The Tsar ordered his generals to hold the defensive line around Mahilov at all costs, as Moscow could be easily assaulted from there. Capitalizing on the disorder within the Russian armies due to recent events, Charles sent a small diversionary force under Spare to Borisov in order to stall Goltz and his 8,000 men. The main Swedish force arrived at Bereza-Sapieska on the 25th of June and immediately started working on crossing the rivers and marshes in front of them. By the time Goltz realized what was happening, Charles was already halfway to Mahilov. Utterly surprised by the speed at which the Swedish army crossed such difficult terrain, Sheremetev and Menshikov left to form a defensive line at Holovchin, 24 kilometers away from Mahilov. Charles arrived near the town of Holovchin on the 10th of July. There he met a strong Russian cavalry force, which he did not yet have enough men to engage in a direct battle. The cavalry retreated slowly across the river. Because of the thick forests that surrounded the town, the majority of the Swedish army arrived only later that day. There was very little action in the next couple of days, as the Swedes waited for all of their units to arrive, while the Russian army was fortifying its position. Those fortifications were completed on the 13th. Trenches ran down the river and edge of the forest for several kilometers, and many artillery batteries were placed along those lines, along with a chevaux de frise. The Russian army was led by fierce rivals Menshikov and Sheremetev, as well as Repnin. They had around 30,000 men on their side. The Swedish army, led by Charles, consisted of 12 to 13,000 men, together with 28 artillery pieces. The Russian army was spread over the entire length of the trenches. However, the parts of the army that were under the command of different generals had barely any communication with each other. At 1:30 at night, the Swedish artillery, which was placed on a hill, started firing on the Russian positions under Repnin. Afterwards, the Swedish army started crossing the Vabik River, with Charles being again the first to enter the water. The Russian soldiers could not fight the Swedish crossing due to relentless artillery fire. As each unit crossed, they started engaging the Russians in battle, forcing a large part of Repnin's forces to retreat to the forest behind them. A part of the Swedish infantry wheeled to the left after crossing, thereby cutting off Repnin from the rest of the Russian army. The Russian infantry passed over their own trenches to reach the marshland. This led to them getting separated from the cavalry along the trenches, which were afterwards quickly routed. Once the Swedish forces reached the forest where the Russian infantry retreated, they came under heavy fire. At that point, Charles rode to every infantry battalion and urged them to fight the Russians with pikes and swords, rather than fire at them. They subsequently charged the Russian forces in the forest and quickly defeated them in hand-to-hand combat. By that time, it was already too late for the rest of the Russian army to offer any assistance, so they retreated to Shklov. The Swedish forces lost only around 250 men, while the Russians suffered some 2,000 casualties. As the Russian commanders didn't expect Charles to attack such a difficult position, effectively only a third of the Russian army actually participated in the battle. Charles decisively defeated the disorganized Russian army at the Battle of Holovchin. However, the majority of the soldiers and generals escaped unharmed to Smolensk. The bridges across the Dnieper were burned during the retreat. The Swedish soldiers were exhausted from the forced marching, food shortages, and bad weather, so they could not build new bridges for a month. After crossing the Dnieper, it became evident that the Russian forces had extensively employed scorched earth tactics. The area between Mahilov and Smolensk was completely devastated, with peasants fleeing with their cattle into the forests and leaving neither crops, tools, nor any other kind of supplies for the Swedes. Additionally, the Russian army burned down almost all buildings, leaving no sturdy shelter from the worsening weather. Seeing a direct advance towards Moscow as suicide, the Swedish command reviewed their possible options. As Charles refused to advance into Russia in the aftermath of the Battle of Narva, it came as a surprise to many that he chose to do so now. A variety of factors contributed to his decision. His belief that Ruthenia was a prosperous and resource-rich land, that the Ukrainians wanted to rebel against the Russians, and that he could expect aid from the Cossacks and Crimean Tatars. Meanwhile, a Polish army advanced into Ruthenia as well. The hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, Ivan Mazepa, was worried at this confluence of several large armies into his lands. He asked Peter for military support. However, the Tsar refused, content to just shadow the Swedish army during its march. Mazepa saw this as a betrayal of a treaty between the Cossacks and Russia, and promptly allied with the Poles and the Swedes. The Russians retaliated quickly, seizing the Zaporozhian capital of Baturin, massacring all of its inhabitants and allegedly tying them to crosses and floating them down the Dnieper. The Russian army also continuously employed scorched earth tactics, depleting the land of anything useful. Trying to avoid further Russian reprisals, the Zaporozhians replaced Mazepa with a new hetman and continued fighting on the Russian side. The Swedish army, once again low on supplies, was eager for the arrival of the support army. Lewenhaupt's support army was supposed to meet the main army at Mahilov in August. With significantly fewer men and resources than planned, they nonetheless managed to leave Riga in July. Due to bad weather, they fell significantly behind the main army. Peter was aware that Charles was expecting a relief force, which put Leeuwenhoup's army at great risk as soon as they were discovered. His army crossed the Dnieper River on the 2nd or 3rd of October. Russian troops started harassing them as soon as the 6th. On the 9th, the support army was merely 10 kilometers away from Slavhorat, Propoysk, where they planned to cross the Sos. It was at that point, near the village of Lesnaya, that a large Russian army started attacking them. Because of previous raids and rumors that Russian troops had already taken Propoysk, Leeuwenhaupt arrayed his support army defensively. 700 infantry and cavalry were placed at the front, followed by half the baggage. They were followed by several cavalry units, behind which was the rest of the baggage train. The remaining soldiers were placed at the edge of the forest in order to prevent any attacks. In total, Leeuwenhaupt had between 12,000 and 13,000 soldiers at his disposal, along with 16 artillery pieces. Not all of them would participate in the battle though, as about a quarter were posted to defend the baggage train. The Russian army was led by Peter himself, though he had some of his most competent generals there also. Besides the 1,000 men which took Propoysk, the Russian army numbered between 26,000 and 28,000 men, together with a massive number of cannons, possibly around 100. The battle started when the 700 Swedish soldiers in the front came under fire from the 1,000 Russian soldiers that took Propoysk. The main Russian army, on the other hand, advanced in 2 columns towards the Swedish positions, with the main goal being to take the clearing in the forest and the bridge over the Lesnyanka stream. Menshikoff's 7,000-strong column reached the forest clearing. However, they were quickly pushed back by 900 Swedes using their famous Karolian shock tactics. Hearing the gunfire, another Swedish regiment marched towards the gunfire, causing confusion within the 2 groups. Those regiments suffered some losses and were forced to retreat. Peter's and Menshikov's columns joined up at a crossroads near the Lesnyanka River, where they were met by 2,000 Swedes under Steckelberry. After his position was reinforced by another 2,500 men, Steckelberry's troops started pushing Peter's column back, even capturing some of their guns. It was only the elite Russian guards that held the line and prevented a complete rout. The Russians were much more successful in their other column. Menshikov's flanking maneuver managed to completely push the Swedes out of the forest clearing. Steckelberry subsequently ordered a retreat towards Lesnaya, leaving the Russians in control of the forest. Leeuwenhaupt attempted a counterattack to regain control, though he was unsuccessful. The fighting subsequently transferred to the fields outside Lesnaya. After a pause in the fighting, at 4 p.m. the armies started battling again. A newly arrived Russian cavalry force under Bauer charged the Swedish lines. As Karolian tactics excel in open terrain, Bauer was pushed back. In the next couple of hours, the Swedes killed many Russian soldiers. However, the sheer size of the Russian army ensured that they would suffer quite a few casualties too. Over time, they were pushed closer and closer to Lesnaya, leaving the bridge over the Lesnyanka exposed to Russian attacks. Just as the Swedish army was on the brink of defeat, the 700 soldiers that were at the front of the baggage train arrived and repulsed the Russian forces at the bridge. With their arrival, the united Swedish army fought even more aggressively and managed to push the Russian army back. At 7 p.m, the battle stopped. The Russians retreated to the forest to recuperate, while the Swedes stood in battle formation for several hours still, expecting a night attack. The attack never came though. Not wanting to waste time, Leeuwenhaupt ordered the army to assemble and to start marching towards the Sos at once. With the carriages and artillery being a much greater burden with so many fewer men, the general ordered the guns to be sunk in the marshes. By the time they reached Propoysk, the Russians had already put the town to the torch. Expecting an enemy attack at any moment, Leeuwenhaupt later ordered that all of the baggage which cannot be carried across the river should be burned or left behind. The soldiers used this opportune moment to indulge in food and drink. Many of them would wander drunk into the forest and marshes, never to be seen again. In the end, The Russians lost about 7,000 men in the Battle of Lesnaya, while the Swedes lost around 3,000. On the other hand, Lewenhaupt lost many more men at Propoysk to fear and alcohol. Only half of the men and very few provisions ended up crossing the Soz in the end. The small force which did reach Charles was nowhere near as strong as he had hoped. Moreover, the winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the coldest on record. This, together with the scorched earth tactics, left the Swedish army in a disastrous state. Thousands of soldiers starved to death or succumbed to disease, and many simply froze to death. The Russians suffered many casualties during winter as well, though nowhere near as many as the Swedes. At the approach of spring, Charles was left with less than half of the men that he had started the campaign with. The great Cossack rebellion which he expected did not materialize. Mazeppa promised tens of thousands of soldiers for the upcoming battles against the Russians, yet the number that he could realistically muster was much smaller than that. Charles's last hope was Stanisław. The Polish and Swedish forces kept regular lines of communication during their advance into Ruthenia. Since correspondence between the two forces stopped during winter, Charles assumed that the weather simply bogged down his allies' army. The reality of the situation turned out to be far more disheartening. Stanisław's armies retreated into Poland to consolidate power, and due to a miscommunication between himself and his commanders, nobody informed Charles that he was left alone. In the end, it was one of his own envoys to the Ottoman Empire that informed the Swedish king of Stanisław's position. Unable to advance or retreat, Charles saw only one option for his army's survival. He needed to capture a well-provisioned fort and wait until support arrived. On the 1st of May 1709, the Swedish army besieged the port of Poltava, some 300 kilometers east of Kiev. The Swedes could have taken the fort easily by force. However, Charles did not want to risk any unnecessary damage to the defenses or the grain stores. Peter saw this moment as critical. He advanced towards Poltava from northern Ruthenia and ordered most of his senior generals to assemble there with their troops. By June 15th, the entire Russian army had arrived on the east bank of the Voskla River. Peter's primary objective was to cross the river with his army. To divert the attention of the Swedes, he sent some cavalry to feign a crossing south of Poltava. Charles then rode out of his camp to see what was happening. What occurred next was one of those minor chance events that sometimes decide the fate of nations. The Swedish king was shot in the foot by a Cossack and refused to have the wound tended to until he nearly fell unconscious. To make matters worse, this took place on June 17th, his birthday, a bad omen which further demoralized the Swedish troops. While Charles was weakened by fever, his generals could not agree on the response against the Russians. Peter used this opportunity to cross the river and set up camp north of Poltava. The camp was fortified afterwards, and a series of redoubts were built. To the rear, the Russian position was protected by the river and marshland. There was no chance of the Swedes mounting any flanking maneuvers. The Swedish army numbered around 22,000 men, with a similar amount of cavalry and infantry. They also had around 30 guns. However, the artillery was not used during the battle, since Charles anticipated a quick breakthrough. There were also around 3,000 of Mazeppa's Cossacks and 1,000 Poles on the Swedish side. The Russian army had in total around 80,000 men, with over 30,000 infantry, around 20,000 horsemen, and 23 to 25,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks. The Russians also had over 100 guns. The numbers and the positions of the armies remind us of the Battle of Narva. Nevertheless, there are two important differences here. The Swedish army wasn't led by its best commander, and the Russian army had been transformed from a peasant mob into a credible fighting machine. The Swedish War Council debated on whether they should use a cautious or aggressive plan of attack. The more senior commanders in the army preferred a steady offensive, while the younger ones proposed an all-out attack. In the end, the king chose to heed the advice to strike the iron while it's hot. Unable to take part in the battle himself, Charles devised a battle plan and entrusted it to Field Marshal Rienschuld. What Charles did not know was that the Field Marshal was on bad terms with most of the other generals. On account of that, he failed to relay the plans properly to them, dealing a significant blow to the organization and cohesion of the army before the battle even started. Preparations for the battle started on the 9th of July 7th. The Swedes left 2,500 men to guard the baggage train and camp, 2,000 in front of Poltava to prevent a breakout, and another 1,500 to check the Cossacks and Kalmyks. A crucial part of Charles's plan was the element of surprise, so the army started preparing to attack at night. The lack of organization became evident here, as the cavalry took too long to form up and the summer night was quite short. By the time the Swedes were ready to attack, the Russians were already alert. At 4 AM, General Rus started the Swedish offensive by trying to envelop the first frontal redoubts. The Swedes attacked relentlessly and took the first two, but they were unable to advance further. Russian artillery devastated the assaulting soldiers, and they did not have enough men left to attack the remaining redoubts. The Russian commanders still feared the Swedish troops and asked Peter to send the infantry from his camp to aid the defenders at the redoubts. Peter decided to not make any unnecessary moves, since he knew that the Swedes were suffering heavy casualties and that it would only be a matter of time before they lost steam. While this was happening, Löwenhaupt and Rienschuld drove back the main body of the Russian army behind the redoubts. However, they did not coordinate their attacks well enough and were split up. Charles, watching the battle from afar, ordered both Rus and Löwenhaupt to reconnect with the main body of the army outside of the Russian camp. Rus had lost most of his men already and decided to retreat to a redoubt by the river, where he later surrendered. Löwenhaupt, after several hours of inconclusive fighting, led his 2,400 men through intense artillery fire to Rienschuld's force. With what was left of the Swedish army united, they began advancing towards the main Russian force. It was at this point that Peter ordered the gates of the camp to be opened and 30,000 of his infantry to array in battle lines. The cavalry subsequently formed up at the flanks. The Swedish commanders, seeing that the Russian line was significantly wider than their own, stretched the Karolians thin in an effort to avoid envelopment. While they were approaching the Russian army, Peter's artillery devastated the Swedish forces. Fearless in the face of death, the elite Swedish infantry approached until they could see the white in their enemies' eyes and unleashed several musket volleys. What was supposed to be their deadliest weapon came to be almost useless. The winter cold and bad weather in the last year reduced the quality of their gunpowder, and most of the shots did not even reach the Russians. The Russian volleys, in contrast, killed many Swedes. Starving, exhausted, and hopelessly outnumbered, the entire Swedish army charged. The few units which made it to the Russian lines fought bravely before being killed. Sources tell that only the company led by Count Torstensson, grandson of the famous Lennart Torstensson, managed to penetrate the Russian lines before being enveloped and massacred together with their leader. As the defeated Swedes retreated from the battlefield, the Russian cavalry pursued them and cut down many. Meanwhile, Charles, after having his bodyguards killed by a cannonball, gathered what was left of his army and retreated south. In the end, the Swedes lost around 7,000 men, with a further 2,700 captured, including Rienschuld and other top commanders. The Russians had 1,300 men killed and another 3,300 injured. Constantly pursued by the Russian army under Menshikov, Charles sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire with 1,000 of his men. The rest of his army, in the hands of Löwenhaupt, surrendered to the Russians at Perivolozhna 3 days after the battle. The captured commanders were kept as Peter's prisoners, while the soldiers that caused Peter so much trouble were settled in Siberia. For Sweden, the Battle of Poltava was a catastrophic defeat. Its elite continental army was annihilated, grievously reducing its defensive capabilities. Peter called his great victory at Poltava a divine miracle, as he finally managed to defeat the most formidable army in Europe. Russian armies would now be free to encroach into Poland and the Baltic without any resistance. Following nearly a decade of Swedish domination in the Great Northern War, Russia would now gain the upper hand. Peter left Poltava for Kiev shortly after the surrender of the Swedish army at Perevalozhna. Once there, he sent letters throughout the continent describing the details of the battle and his complete victory. Europe was left in complete shock. Until that moment, they had only received news of continuous Swedish victories. The Duke of Marlborough famously wrote, "We have no confirmation as yet of the battle between the Swedes and the Muscovites, but should it be true of the first being so entirely beaten as is reported, what a melancholy reflection it is that after constant success for 10 years, Charles XII should in 2 hours' mismanagement and ill success ruin himself and his country." The rest of Europe's elite had a similar disposition towards the Russian victory. However, some welcomed Russia onto the European stage. The famous polymath and philosopher Leibniz remarked that Peter would now be the Turk of the North. Charles himself only avoided capture by sacrificing the majority of his elite army and his most trusted commanders. Though Russian forces pursued the Swedish king, they could not catch him before he crossed the Bug and entered Ottoman territory. Sultan Ahmed III prepared a camp for Charles and his followers at Bender, and they would settle there for the time being. Peter was elated because of his grand victory, yet he was also equally disappointed due to Charles and Mazeppa's escape into Ottoman lands. Wasting no time, the Tsar entered diplomatic talks with Augustus of Saxony, Frederick of Denmark, Frederick William of Prussia, and George I of Hanover. The victorious Russian army was subsequently split in two. Sheremetev would move north towards the Baltic, while Menshikov would advance west into Poland. Stanisław, whose position in Poland was already negligible, saw his royal authority erode completely after the defeat of the Karolian army. Augustus repudiated the Treaty of Altenstadt and advanced into Poland with an army. The magnates of the Commonwealth, either out of dislike towards Stanisław or fear of Russian aggression, began endearing themselves to their former monarch and offered him the crown once again. Left without any alternative, Stanisław joined the Swedish forces in their retreat to Pomerania and then abdicated. To compensate him for the lost crown, Charles granted him the Principality of Zweibrücken and named him Count Palatine. King once again, Augustus met Peter on the 9th of October at Turin. He feared Peter's reaction to having been abandoned in 1706. However, the Tsar did not hold a grudge. Nevertheless, at dinner, Peter could not resist an ironic thrust at Augustus's faithlessness. "I always wear the cutlass you gave me," Peter said, "but it seems you do not care for the sword I gave you, as I see you are not wearing it." Augustus replied that he prized Peter's gift, but that somehow in the haste of his departure from Dresden, he had left it behind. "Ah," said Peter, "then let me give you another." He gave Augustus the same sword he had given him before, which had been discovered in Charles's baggage at Poltava. The monarchs signed a new treaty that effectively made the Commonwealth a Russian dependency in all but name. The Russians were allowed to station their troops in the Commonwealth. Peter would become the guarantor of the rights of the Polish nobility, while Augustus would join all of Peter's wars. One secret clause of the treaty was that Augustus would be allowed to claim Livonia. In the following days, Peter also established alliances with the Prussians and the Danes, who would enter the war again by October 1709. Although the Danish king was eager to enter the war and conquer, he did not take into account the readiness of his army. The best Danish soldiers were away, fighting in the Spanish Wars of Succession under the Duke of Marlborough. The 14,000 men that landed near Helsingborg at the end of November were inexperienced, badly supplied, and poorly equipped. The commander-in-chief of the Danish army, Christian Dietzlau Reyentlauw, wanted to advance quickly on the rest of Scania. The poor state of his army prevented him from doing so, and he only started moving from Helsingborg in January. Following the capture of Kristianstad, Landskrona and Malmö were besieged. Hearing of the Danish invasion, the general Magnus Stenbock started assembling an army at Vekør. Due to the fact that his army consisted mostly of recruits, he was hesitant to march against the Danes. Fortunately for him, the Norwegians could not organize their army at the time, and did not even launch a single raid across the border. This freed up several veteran regiments that were guarding the Norwegian border to join his army. On February 22, 1710, Stenbock started advancing towards Scania with a large force. Rentlaug's initial plan was to capture some smaller settlements between Malmö and Landskrona in order to gather supplies from the people there, and afterwards set up a strong defensive position to await Stenbock. The lack of supplies and winter clothing, however, took a severe toll on the Danish army. Disease spread through their ranks, and even Rentlau fell gravely ill. His replacement, Rantzau, proved far less capable. Rantzau abandoned his position in the south of Scania and moved back towards Helsingborg. Stenbock did not actively look for a big confrontation at the time, as he wanted to train his soldiers. On the 8th of March, Stenbock arrived with his army at Flensborg, 10 kilometers to the northeast of Helsingborg. Later, Stenbock marched his army towards Helsingborg, placing it between Palhøskog and Pilsudsvagen. Rantzau placed his army in a wide line in front of Helsingborg, facing Krupp. On the 10th, at 11 in the morning, the fog lifted and both armies were surprised to find each other in such positions. Both armies had approximately 14,000 men, with cavalry placed on the wings and infantry in the center. The Danish also had several artillery pieces, however the exact number is unknown. Meanwhile, the Swedish army had 34 guns. Seeing that his left flank was vulnerable, Rantzau sent his artillery to Ringstorpshøjden, while the rest of his army wheeled towards the open plains where the Swedes were. Stenbock's forces came under heavy artillery fire around 12:30. Instead of attacking them directly, Stenbock moved his army to the left and sent his left wing to Drottninghøg to outflank the Danish right. Rantzau went himself to attack and rout the flanking force on the right. Although it was a brave move on his part, this left the army in a difficult place regarding communication. In order to not lose contact with their right flank, the Danish center started moving towards the right as well. Some of the cavalry on the Swedish right used this opportunity to attack the Danish center. The Danes managed to push them back with the help of their left flank. However, this left many gaps in their lines. Rantzau's heroic actions earned him a shot in the chest, and the Danish right collapsed together with their leader. The right flank lost cohesion and retreated towards Helsingborg, and the left followed suit. The center still believed that the right was in front of them. Due to lack of command and communication, the first line kept advancing, while the second stopped moving. At that point, the Swedish infantry charged, covered by their cannons. The Swedish cavalry on the left subsequently converged on the flanks and rear of the center. The Danish center broke after some fighting, with only the Home Guard and a Grenadier Corps holding up a fierce defense. The Home Guard fought almost to the last man, taking many Swedes down with them. The Danish right formed a defensive line at Ringstorpshøjden, although they were forced to retreat after the Swedish left's relentless onslaught. At 3 in the afternoon, the Danish Grenadier Corps retreated in peace to Helsingborg, and with that, the battle was over. The Swedes lost almost 3,000 men, while the Danes had 5,000 killed or wounded and another 2,600 captured. Not wanting to risk losing more men on an assault, Stenbock surrounded the city. The leaderless Danish army boarded their ships on the 15th and crossed the Sound, but not before destroying anything of value in the city, including killing all the horses. As a result of his victory, Stenbock was promoted to Field Marshal. The Battle of Helsingborg effectively marks the last time that the Danish tried to reclaim Scania. Ironically, at the beginning of the invasion, the Danish army had "now or never" written on their wagons. As Augustus was consolidating his power in the Commonwealth for most of 1710, and the Danish were rebuilding their armies at the same time, the western front of the war went through a lull for most of the year. The same cannot be said for the Eastern Baltic, though. Sweden's Baltic ports remained relatively undefended now that the Karolian army had capitulated. In July, Riga, Sweden's richest and most populous city, surrendered to the Russians after negotiating the restorations of old privileges for the Livonian nobility. According to the Treaty of Turin, Riga was supposed to be handed over to Augustus. However, the topic seemingly never resurfaced again. Dünemünde and Pernau fell in August, while Arensberg and Revel capitulated in September. The natural next move for Peter would have been towards Karelia and Finland. The Tsar already tried to take Viborg in 1706, however he was unable to do so because of a lack of supplies and proper artillery. With the war now going in his favour, he endeavoured to try again. In January 1710, Russian raiding parties started pillaging the countryside near Viborg. In February, the new garrison commander, Magnus Hoanstrael, received word that a large army was gathering at St. Petersburg and Kotlin. He asked his superior, Yuri Liebecker, for more reinforcements. The incompetent governor was seemingly not interested in fighting the Russians or fortifying Viborg, as he only sent a few hundred men, keeping the rest to reinforce the forts of Kexholm and Nislot, modern-day Savonlinna. In fact, Liebecker left the city just a few days before the Russians arrived. In total, the garrison numbered around 3,500, with 10 to 15 cannons, while the Russians arrived with 13,000 men. In the years after the first siege of Viborg, the castle had been undergoing repairs. Be that as it may, part of the fortifications were still weak, like the southern Pantsalax bastion. The Russian advance guard arrived 15 kilometers west of Viborg in the middle of March and reached the suburbs of the city on the 21st. There they clashed with two Swedish regiments. The Swedes retreated to the city afterwards, but not before burning the grain stores. The Russian army immediately started preparing the siege works. Digging trenches proved to be a strenuous and time-consuming task, as the ground was stony and still frozen. Nevertheless, by the end of the month, they would start digging trenches on the eastern side of the fort too. On the 1st of April, the Russian artillery corps started bombarding Viborg. This did not have much of an effect, as only small guns could have been brought across the ice. By late April, both sides started suffering from supply shortages. The Russian forces did not conduct many raids in nearby towns and villages, as Swedish guerrilla fighters frequently killed Russian troops there. Regular Swedish sallies were also devastating for the Russian troops. The Russian Admiral General Apraksin started planning to storm the city. However, he reconsidered after Peter told him that he would suffer the consequences if it would fail. The siege continued without any major events until the beginning of May. On the 6th, a Swedish sally killed hundreds of Russian soldiers and set fire to a part of their gunpowder stores. The fort's cannons also managed to destroy or disable several Russian guns. With the ice and snow now melting, the Russians could afford to bring more troops and supplies for the siege. Liebecker asked for aid from the Swedish Navy, as only they could save Viborg if the Russians brought their full force. Relieving Viborg was not a priority for the Swedish Navy. In contrast, on the 11th of May, when Peter received Apraksin's letter that they only had a few days' worth of food left, he immediately set sail for Viborg through the still ice-covered sea. The ships arrived on the 20th, bringing the Russian besiegers precious food and another 100 guns. The unloading area was within shooting distance for the fort's artillery. To bypass this, the Russian ships flew Swedish colours and engaged in mock artillery battles with the men on the shore. The Swedish fleet finally reached the area in the last days of May. They didn't have a sufficient number of light ships though, so they couldn't engage the Russian fleet in any way. On the night of June 1st, the Russians opened a devastating artillery barrage that targeted the walls, the bastions, and the city itself. Meanwhile, on the eastern side, the Russian troops reached Pantsalax and placed a mine under the bastion. On the 6th, Apraksin decided that it was finally time to storm the city. Against his orders, on that very night, one of his officers attempted to do that only with his own units. The assault failed after the officer lost most of his men, and he was subsequently placed under arrest. it is possible that Juan Strail found out from one of his new prisoners that Apraxin planned to storm the city. Realizing that future resistance was futile, he sent an envoy on the 9th to negotiate the surrender of Viborg under good conditions. Peter signed the document on the 10th of June, which stated that the soldiers would be able to leave with their arms and their families. Peter did not keep that promise, and all of the defenders became prisoners of war. With this, Peter had finally achieved one of his main personal goals, to form a powerful defensive corridor around his capital, St. Petersburg. The Russians led several offensives into Finland during the next 2 years. However, due to logistical issues, they were unsuccessful. No sooner had Charles taken refuge in the Ottoman Empire, Peter had begun sending letters to the Sultan, requesting the Swedish king's extradition. These letters became increasingly threatening as the months passed, much to the annoyance of Ahmed. Taking the last of Peter's letters as a personal insult, the Sultan declared war on Russia in October of 1710. The Tsar was still under the impression of his victory at Poltava, and this prompted him to enter the war with a much smaller army than the Ottoman one, relying only on the support of Moldavia and Wallachia. This war, known as the Pruth Campaign, ended in a swift defeat for the Russians, with Peter himself only avoiding being captured due to the incompetence of the Ottoman Grand Vizier. The subsequent Pruth Treaty stipulated, among other things, that Peter would allow Charles free passage to Sweden. Charles would not use that right, however, instead choosing to remain in the Ottoman Empire to try and persuade the Sultan to attack Russia again. In 1711, the Allied forces began a massive offensive into Swedish Pomerania, besieging the fortresses of Stralsund, Stettin and Wismar. But since the armies were more interested in raiding the countryside, the sieges were not effective. Additionally, disagreements between the commanders and a lack of siege artillery ensured that nothing of note would be achieved. In September, Stenbock landed on the island of Rügen with a large army. Alarmed at the prospect of facing a strong Swedish army, the Allied forces retreated from Stralsund and Stettin. As the Allies were insufficiently strong to take such well-garrisoned cities, they remained content with sporadic raids on smaller settlements. In the spring of 1712, another strong Swedish army arrived in Stralsund. Consequently, the Danish navy began tightening its grip over the Baltic Sea, which worsened the situation for the defenders of the Swedish forts. Stenbock knew that Stralsund would not survive a combined land and sea-based blockade. However, facing the combined Danish-Saxon-Russian army was not a feasible option either. In autumn, the Allied forces split up into two, so that one part could raid Mecklenburg. In the end, he decided on the latter option. Peter was in Dresden at the time, recovering from an illness. He was already furious because of the lack of coordination between the Allied commanders, and after hearing of Stenbock advancing towards Mecklenburg, he ordered his forces to engage in a pursuit without him. Stenbock advanced quickly, much faster than the Russian-Saxon armies did. On the 3rd of December, the Danish army encamped for winter quarters southwest of Wismar, near the town of Gadebusch. The Swedish army arrived at Wernau on the 14th, and by the 18th, they were already at Brusewitz, merely 10 kilometers away from the Danish army. At that point, the Russian army was south of Lake Schwerin and could not provide any assistance. Only a small Saxon cavalry detachment arrived to aid the Danish by the eve of the battle. Stenbock knew that any delay would be detrimental to his cause, so he marched his army through a snowstorm, arriving on the other side of the river on the morning of the 20th. Jobst von Scholtens, the leader of the Danish army, placed his forces behind a river and dense marshland near the village of Falkenstedt. The strong Danish defensive position made their leaders believe that the Swedes would turn south and try to cross the river at a safer point before attacking. After reconnaissance, however, Stenbock concluded that their only chance of victory would be through a full frontal assault. The Allied army was around 17,000 strong, with 8,000 Danish infantrymen, 5,000 cavalry, along with another 4,000 Saxon horsemen. The Swedish army had about 12,500 men, with 6,500 footmen and 6,000 cavalry. Both sides placed their infantry in the center and their cavalry on the flanks. The Swedes had 30 cannons, while the Danish had 14. Jobst von Scholten led the Danish army, Jakob von Flemming led the cavalry on the left flank. Stenbock led the Swedish army. At 1 PM, the Swedish artillery opened fire and the rest of their troops advanced. The Swedes were using a new type of cannon, which was more mobile and precise than the Danish artillery. Their artillery barrage not only managed to cover the advance of their troops, but also dealt heavy casualties to the Danish forces. The Swedish infantry advanced towards the Danish position through a narrow clearing. Adhering to the Karolian tactics, they advanced until they could discern their enemy's facial features and fired several devastating volleys. The Danish infantry returned fire, however it was not precise. Scholtens attempted to break the Swedish centre with a cavalry attack from the right. This attack failed due to precise Swedish volleys, as well as artillery barrages, and the cavalry retreated after suffering significant casualties. Afterwards, the Swedish left attacked the winded Danish right. This forced Scholten to wheel his entire army to the left to avoid being outflanked. Simultaneously, the Swedish cavalry on the right managed to find a small path through the marsh and attacked. The Danish left was caught completely by surprise and began retreating because of the relentless Swedish assault. The Allied army, though in a strong defensive position, was suffering from disorganization. Flemming, the leader of the Danish forces on the left, requested that the cavalry which was kept behind Wagenstedt be brought to the front on the morning of the battle. Scholten acquiesced, however his order came in late and those cavalry regiments were caught behind the Danish left during the retreat. As they were unprepared for battle and caught in a position where maneuvering was difficult, disorder broke loose within their ranks. They were pushed back to Wagenstedt, where brutal fighting ensued. The quick and precise Swedish assault along the entire front pushed the Danish army back and some units began routing. Unable to save their left flank, Flemming and Scholtens retreated behind Wagenstedt and formed a new defensive line there. The Swedish left once again assaulted the Danish right. However, they were fired upon by the Danish Royal Guard and lost some of their momentum. Nevertheless, the Danish right almost broke, and Flemming had to reinforce it with his Saxon cavalry. The Saxons managed to stabilize the line. However, their attempts to push the Swedes back were unsuccessful. The Royal Guard still continued firing at the Swedish cavalry, causing many casualties. This forced Stenbock to send his elite infantry regiments to fight them, and the two sides engaged in a brutal melee. This engagement was eventually won by the Swedes, and the Danish centre began to retreat. The Saxons, though unable to defeat the Swedish left, fought fiercely and ensured that their enemies could not pursue the retreating forces. Most of the troops on the Danish left were either killed or captured, and only a few soldiers managed to retreat with the rest of the army. In the end, the Danish army lost all of their artillery and about 6,500 men, most of whom were captured, while the Swedes lost 1,500. Although this battle was a tactical success for Stenbock's army, it proved to be strategically insignificant. The Danish army was not completely broken, and the Russians and Saxons still had overwhelming numerical superiority. Furthermore, the Swedish army was no longer within the safety of Stralsund's walls, and marching back would be a risky move. A lack of supplies also began to take its toll on them, and to make matters worse, the Baltic Sea was still frozen, so resupplying by ship was not an option. Stenbock subsequently moved west with his army, trying to extort funds and supplies out of the Danish-controlled city of Altona. When the citizens failed to meet the overwhelming demands, the Swedish army burned the city to the ground. The army headed east afterwards, however, it was surrounded by a large Russian-Saxon force nearby Turning. Breaking his neutrality, Charles Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp provided refuge to the Swedish army inside his fort. As with the Spanish War of Succession nearly over, the Duke expected aid from Great Britain and the United Provinces, just like in 1700. Their ships never arrived, and with hunger and disease running rampant throughout his army, Stenbock surrendered on the 13th of May. Having lost another army, Charles seemed to be in dire straits, with defeat being an increasingly realistic option. The Allied powers were more than willing to make peace with Sweden. Charles, adamant that he would not relinquish even an inch of land, refused even the most lenient offers. With the king so headstrong and averse to defeat, it became evident that war-weary Sweden would not sue for peace, at least not while Charles XII was still breathing. With Sweden's final great continental army neutralized, Peter I of Russia was finally able to retire to his new capital and enjoy his favorite pastime, the navy. The commander of the Russian army in Germany, Menshikov, had no time to celebrate after his victory. He besieged Sweden's 3 strongholds once again, and extorted a large sum of money from the city of Hamburg as punishment for aiding the Swedes. The Tsar would use that money to purchase several state-of-the-art ships from the Dutch. Even though he was winning on all fronts, Peter wished to make peace as soon as possible. Continuous wars had a devastating effect on Russia, and the threat of a new war with the Ottomans was looming. To his joy, however, Charles had been arrested by the Sultan for conspiracy, and Crimean raids were becoming increasingly rare. This allowed him to focus on Sweden's final frontier, Finland. With new troops and resources, Admiral Apraksin was able to swiftly advance into southern Finland. The new Russian navy played a pivotal role during the Finnish campaign, as supply shortages were the main cause of Russian failures there after the capture of Viborg. Peter refused to risk the expensive Dutch ships of the line for such operations, instead opting to use the much larger and easily replaceable galley fleet. By transporting his men behind the Swedish army, Peter was able to force General Liebecker to retreat several times, until he was finally replaced by a more capable commander. On the 8th of May 1713, a large Russian army was able to land near Helsinki. The Swedes, now under the command of Armfelt, managed to defend the city for some time. In the end, the size of the Russian army proved to be too much for the small Swedish force, and Armfelt ordered a retreat to Porvoo, though not before burning Helsinki and all of its supplies. In September, the Russian army captured Turku, thereby securing the entire southern coast of Finland. Around the same time, one of Sweden's strongholds in Pomerania, Stettin, fell as well. The city was immediately given to the Prussians, who did not have to fire a single bullet in the conflict. Stralsund and Wismar still held strong, however the Allied noose was tightening around them. At this point, the Swedish government in Stockholm did not view Finland as an important theatre in the war. Therefore, very little was done to combat the Russian fleet's dominance in the area, and Armfelt had to rely only on local recruits for his small army. After the fall of Turku, Armfelt placed his army in a defensive position near the next great Finnish city on the Russian warpath, Tampere. In October, he faced a 5 times larger Russian army at the Battle of Pelikkene. Armfelt took up defensive positions with his troops on an isthmus near Tampere, between the lakes of Palkanivesi and Malevesi. He had approximately 3,700 men under his command, with 2,200 footmen and 1,500 cavalry, together with 28 light field guns. The cavalry was placed a bit further from the rest of the troops, near the village of Malkila. Apraksin made his base in a village on the other side of the isthmus. His army numbered 14,000 men and 22 guns. The main Russian army was split in 2 halves, one led by Bruce and another by Golovin. 3 squadrons were also prepared especially for an amphibious assault, and they were led by Golitsyn. The battle started on the morning of the 17th of October. Apraksin realized immediately that the well-entrenched Finnish army was in an excellent defensive position. A frontal attack under such circumstances would have been extremely costly. Therefore, he opted to send Golitzin's amphibious assault units to the west side of the isthmus, while the main force feigned a full frontal assault. At the time when they reached the land near Melkila, the Finnish cavalry were still in their quarters. When they finally attacked Golitzin's men, it was already too late, as the prepared Russian soldiers repulsed them with ease. On the east side of the isthmus, Russian troops repeatedly tried to cross the river. However, they were beaten back with heavy losses each time. The mounting pressure on that side of the battlefield did have its purpose, as it diverted attention away from Golitzin's force. At the beachhead, increasing numbers of Russian troops started gathering. To combat this, Armfeldt sent his reserves there. The infantry performed well and killed many Russians. Nevertheless, the subpar performance of the Finnish cavalry proved critical for this battle. It did not take long for the Russian soldiers to rout them, and the infantry, heavily outnumbered, was forced to retreat. With the disorderly retreat of their western flank, the rest of the Finnish army risked being surrounded. Armfeldt also realized this and ordered the rest of the army to retreat. The soldiers there, emboldened by their success, refused to do so. It was only when the Russian cavalry crossed that they were persuaded to flee. Because of the delay, it was possible for the Russian cavalry to harass the retreating soldiers, forcing them to leave most of their artillery behind. Still, the Finnish army lived to fight another day, since they managed to retreat with minimal casualties. They lost around 800 men, while the Russian army suffered a similar number of losses. The two armies met once again at Napue in February 1714. This time around, the Finnish army was decisively defeated. Armfeldt retreated with the remnants of his army to Sweden proper, leaving Finland at the mercy of the Russian occupier. Peter had absolutely no ambition of conquering Finland, and viewed it merely as a bargaining chip to be used to strengthen his position at the negotiating table once the Swedes were actually willing to negotiate. Until then, the land would be thoroughly ravaged in what became known as the Greater Wrath or the Great Hatred. Until the end of the war, Russian soldiers would commit innumerable atrocities in Finland. Looting, rape, torture and murder were widespread, and a large number of Finns were forced to move inland. The Finns also engaged in guerrilla warfare, prompting further retaliation from the Russians. Thousands of men were taken as slaves to St. Petersburg to be used as forced labor in Peter's dockyards or on his many architectural projects. Many children were taken from their homes as well to be used as future soldiers and sailors. The plague had also struck Finland during the occupation, further devastating the area. As in Finland the Russians were at Sweden's doorstep, the ruling council finally decided to ramp up their efforts in the eastern Baltic. A strong Swedish navy under Admiral Vatrang was finally sent to Finland. With their navy unable to enter the Gulf of Bothnia, Russian troops in the areas north of Turku began suffering from supply shortages. The land-based supply routes were slow and insecure, forcing the Russians to divert further resources to the area, resources that Peter would have wanted to use elsewhere. In spring, the Russians finally decided to try to sail by the coast of western Finland. However, a small Swedish force sank most of their ships. In May, Vatrang sailed towards Revel to see if he could capture the city. Upon seeing the improved coastal batteries in the area and several Russian ships of the line moored in the port, he decided that it would be foolish to attempt any kind of assault on the city. Meanwhile, Apraxin sailed from Kronstadt with a large fleet, hoping to tempt Vatrang into a naval encounter in the shallow coastal seas. The two navies met near Cape Hanko on the 29th of June. Although numerically superior, the Russians had far weaker ships than their Swedish counterparts, and their sailors were less experienced. Knowing that his galleys would be decimated in the open sea, Apraxin withdrew all of his ships east of the peninsula, where he awaited further reinforcements from Helsinki. He also informed Peter, who was in Revel, of the situation, and requested that he bring all of the Russian ships of the line with him. Peter joined Apraxin on the 20th of July. However, he deemed the odds too unfavorable to bring his new ships. Galleys had one specific advantage in shallow seas compared to ships of the line. They depended on rowing and could move even when there was no wind. As Golitsyn and his men were now suffering from severe supply troubles, it was imperative for the Russian fleet to reach Turku as soon as possible. Peter's initial idea was to transport the galleys over the Hanko Isthmus. This idea was abandoned after a few days as the task was time-consuming and the ships were severely damaged. Vatrang was unaware that the Russian plan had failed and sent a detachment of 10 ships under Rear Admiral Arenhold to the north of the peninsula. The rest of the Swedish fleet sailed towards the Russian force. Unfortunately for Vatrang, the weather calmed down on the 26th, and his wind-dependent ships of the line could not move further than Hanko. Peter realized what kind of an opportunity had just presented itself, and he sent a vanguard of several ships to bypass Vatrang's fleet and engage Arenhold. Fearing that the rest of the Russian galleys would catch his ships in the shallow coastal waters, Vatrang sailed south, allowing the opposing forces to pass without any resistance. Arenhold, also unable to move, was caught by the large Russian fleet. Apraxin initially tried to convince him to surrender without a fight. Arenhold refused, telling the envoys, "The king did not give me command of these ships so that I would surrender them without a fight. The Tsar can expect nothing from me and my subordinates other than strong resistance." The Swedish fleet consisted of 1 pram, 6 galleys and 2 skerryboats. The ships were arrayed in a semi-crescent in between 2 islands, with the pram in the center and 3 galleys on each side, while the skerryboats were placed behind the line and did not engage in the battle. Apraxin had 98 ships under him, mostly galleys and half-galleys. Only around a quarter of that number would actually engage in the battle. 11 ships in the center, 6 on each flank, and 4 small ones would later attack from behind. The battle started on the morning of the 27th with massive artillery barrages from both sides. The artillery duel was in no way decisive, with ships on both sides sustaining only minimal damage. The Swedish ships carried superior artillery compared to their Russian counterparts. Due to their numbers, the Russians would have won even during a prolonged artillery battle, though with far heavier casualties. With the smoke from the artillery providing cover, the Russian fleet advanced simultaneously towards the Swedish line. This had 2 effects. The Swedish boats would not be able to concentrate their fire as effectively, and the Russian ships would decisively outnumber the Swedish ones. All 11 ships in the Russian center were ordered to advance towards the Swedish pram, called Elephant. Not only was that ship of the line the biggest threat to the Russian fleet, but Peter also wanted to capture it for his own collection. As the Russian ships were approaching, the Russian soldiers and sailors fired at the Swedes with their rifles. The Swedes, who were already heavily outnumbered, could not even mount a proper defense due to relentless incoming fire. The Russian troops began boarding the Swedish ships, and fierce close-quarters combat ensued. The Swedes fought bravely. However, it was only a matter of time until Russian numbers overwhelmed them. To Arenhold's surprise, 4 Russian gunboats went through a narrow passage between the island on their left and the mainland. Those gunboats subsequently attacked the Swedish galleys on the left and captured or sank all of them. The Swedish galleys on the right fell one by one as well, with only the Elephant still resisting. After a fire broke out on the Elephant, Arenhold was captured and the ship was taken over by the Russians. In the end, the Swedish lost all of their ships and men, while the Russian casualties amounted to several hundred men. Though the battle had little to no effect on the Swedish navy, its implications were substantially foreboding. The Russians would now be able to launch devastating raids into Sweden, and the numerically inferior Swedish navy could do little to nothing about it. Indeed, the Åland archipelago was captured later that year, and Umeå was sacked. Vatrang retreated with his fleet to Sweden. However, his failing health prevented him from taking any initiative in the following years. The Swedish defeat caused a sense of panic in Stockholm, and the nobility felt that now it would only be a matter of time before the Russians struck at the capital. Having no other alternative, the Swedish Council of State sent a letter to Charles, informing him that they would start negotiations towards an achievable peace with the coalition unless he returned as quickly as possible. With the Sultan's appetite for war diminished, Charles made an obvious choice. Charles was now determined to reach his homeland, and he rode through Europe at a tremendous speed. He reached Stralsund in November, only 2 weeks after leaving Istanbul. In the following months, Charles started looking for new allies against the coalition. Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia was willing to join the war on Sweden's side in exchange for having Stettin recognized as his own. This did not go well with Charles's no-inch lost doctrine, so he refused. Prussia would enter the war against Sweden in 1715, the same year as Hanover did. In November 1715, a combined Danish-Saxon-Prussian army landed on the island of Rügen. Charles's attempt to stop their advance failed, and he was forced to return to Stralsund. The king's presence may have encouraged his men to continue their stalwart defense, yet the fall of the city was inevitable. With Stralsund surrounded on all sides, Charles left for Sweden on the 22nd of December, merely 2 days before the city fell. 15 years and 3 months after his departure, Charles was finally on the soil of his homeland. This left Sweden with only Wismar on the continent. However, the city fell in 1716 too. Bremen-Verden was partially occupied by Denmark and partially by Hanover. However, George I gained all of it after paying a substantial sum to the Danish king. In 1716, the Allied powers gathered their fleets in Copenhagen and planned a massive assault on the Swedish mainland, with Peter as its commander. Frederick IV of Denmark grew suspicious of Peter's Baltic ambitions, however, refusing to partake in any future actions. Frustrated at this lack of trust between allies, Peter called off the invasion. The loss of Sweden's last holdings on the continent gave both the people and the nobility hope that the war would finally end. Nevertheless, Charles was still determined to continue fighting. More war meant more men and more money, yet Sweden was devastated. Half the farmland was not cultivated because there were no labourers. Fisheries were abandoned. Foreign trade was ruined by the blockade of the Allied fleets. The fact that Charles was able to continue the war in spite of all this seems like nothing short of a miracle. This was only possible due to the appearance of Juri Heinrich von Goetz as Charles's advisor. His administrative skill allowed Charles to raise another army, though his brutal methods only caused further dissent within the kingdom. Goetz also used the distrust among the allies to strengthen Sweden's diplomatic position. By playing George I and Peter against each other, Charles received several relatively favourable separate peace offers. This would have allowed Charles to focus on recovering his Pomeranian possessions. Goetz continuously tried to convince Charles to accept peace with Russia, in what can only be described as a Sisyphean task. To his credit, he did manage to wear down the stubborn king to accept the loss of Karelia and Ingria. Charles invaded Norway in 1716 in order to knock Denmark out of the war. However, the campaign was slow and costly. Finally, it would all be for naught, as on the 30th of November 1718, Charles was shot in the head and killed while besieging Frederikshamn. Whether it was a bullet from the Norwegian defenders or from one of his own men is still a matter of intense debate, as both are distinct possibilities. The beleaguered Swedish army then returned to Sweden with their king's body. While crossing the Scandinavian mountains, thousands would die due to cold and starvation. The last hope of reviving the Swedish Empire died along with Charles. As Charles neither married nor sired any offspring, he was succeeded by his sister Ulrika Eleonora. She decided to renounce her absolute powers, and a period of parliamentary rule in Sweden would ensue. With his protector now dead, Goethe was also imprisoned and executed. Ulrika Eleonora would abdicate in 1720 in favour of her husband, Frederick of Hesse, who held virtually no power. In late 1719 and early 1720, Sweden signed the treaties of helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more.